Jon Snow stood atop the ancient battlements of Winterfell, the chill biting at his cheeks as he rested his hands upon the cold stone. The yard below was bustling with activity. Troops practicing with spears, arrow fletchers tending to half-frozen quivers, and the blacksmith's forge glowing with a furious red heat despite the whirling snow. A dull gray sky loomed overhead, pregnant with the unspoken threat of a storm, but Jon found it strangely comforting, like an old friend who never lied about its intentions. He scanned the grounds, observing the hustle of men and women preparing for the Cold War that would soon come their way. These were the living, those whose hearts still beat with some measure of hope. And though Jon's own chest felt burdened with a weight he could scarcely name, he prayed that their faith in him was not misplaced. There was a tremor inside him that day, not physical but something deeper, lodged beneath bone and sinew. The rumor that he might be the prince that was promised clung to him like the frost clung to the pine branches. And though Jon had once scoffed at prophecies, the Red Woman's voice echoed in the corners of his mind. He was Azor Ahai reborn, or so she believed, come to lead the world against an ancient darkness. Still, he bristled at the thought of prophecy. His entire life had been shaped by secrets, half-truths, and uncertain parentage. Could he really pin hope on a destiny that might as well be smoke and ashes? He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp winter air anchor him in the present moment, reminding him that there were tasks at hand he could not afford to delay. In the courtyard, Sir Davos Seaworth was busy pointing out new recruits, urging them to wrap their wrists more firmly with cloth before taking up swords. Tormund Giantsbane lingered on the sidelines, shaking his head in good-humored scorn at all the fuss, having grown up fighting with nothing but the savage wind as his companion. Jon would have liked to jest with them, to remember simpler times spent with friends around a campfire, but his heart felt too heavy, weighed down by omens. The shadows that hovered beyond the wall seemed to stretch all the way to the heart of Winterfell, and each morning brought new reports of horrors sighted on the horizon. The White Walkers were on the move. Their eerie, soundless march was unstoppable, or so it seemed. Jon took one last look across the landscape. Steepled rooftops dusted with snow, tall towers that had stood for centuries, and then descended the spiral staircase that led into the main hall. The shift in temperature was immediate, a rush of warmth hugging him as he entered the great hall. Torches lined the walls, their flickering flames dancing in tandem with every gust that crept in through the narrow slits of windows. Servants bustled about, refilling jugs of ale, placing fresh bread on the long oak tables. In that hour before midday, the hall was alive with the chatter of newly arrived bannermen and loyal knights, all here to pledge fealty to the king in the north. Jon could hear the distant clang of steel outside the hall, a reminder that there was little time for formalities or pleasantries. Yet every man and woman who had traveled this far north demanded at least a small courtesy, a moment's acknowledgement. He forced a small smile for Lady Mormont, that fierce girl who offered him a curt nod in return. Somehow, her unwavering confidence in him gnawed at his conscience. He wished he shared it. But the night was closing in, and Jon felt trapped in the crosswinds of fear and hope, entirely unsure which direction to face. He wound his way toward the dais, where Sansa sat in earnest conversation with a pair of lords who had once refused to answer their call. The tension in her features softened only a fraction as Jon approached. Sansa regarded him with those blue eyes that seemed to pierce his every hidden thought. She reached out to him, a silent gesture of solidarity that reminded him they faced these trials together. He took her hand and squeezed it gently, letting her warmth seep into his chilled fingertips. Another presence lurked behind them. Melisandre, standing in the shadows, as if she were a specter, blending into the darkness. Her eyes glimmered like embers, focused on Jon with unwavering intensity. Sometimes, he swore she could see straight through him, down into the very nightmares he harbored. Nightmares of skeletal horses, the sound of icy wind howling over a field of corpses, the Night King's glowing blue stare, searing into his soul. Jon wondered if the Red Priestess saw the same things, or if her visions were more terrible still. She offered him a cryptic inclination of her head, as if to say, "Remember what we have foretold." Jon nodded back. It was a gesture that signified neither acceptance nor denial of his prophesied role. But deep within, He could not escape the sense that something grand and terrible was unfolding. That he was not merely a bystander, but a fulcrum upon which fate balanced. Whether he liked it or not, the name Azor Ahai hung in the air whenever he entered a room, spoken in whispers or shouted in fervent prayers. To imagine himself as some legendary figure set to defeat the Night King felt surreal, like a thread pulled too tight across a tapestry of coincidences and myths. The meeting in the hall soon devolved into a litany of logistical concerns. Where would the newly arrived fighters sleep? How would they ration the grain now that caravans from the south were delayed by snows? Who would lead the next scouting party north to track the army of the dead? Through it all, John answered as best he could, conferring with Sansa, Davos, and Lyanna Mormont when needed. Tormund's booming laughter occasionally broke the tension, but there was no real amusement behind it. They were all too aware of what loomed beyond the horizon. Every second spent discussing trivialities was a second spent ignoring the unstoppable avalanche that threatened to bury them. Finally, the gathering dispersed, with lords and ladies drifting to various corners of Winterfell, leaving John alone with Sansa, Davos, and Melisandre in the center of the great space. The Red Priestess spoke first, her voice echoing softly off the stone walls. She said she had had another dream of flames and black ice, of a sword that burned with light, cutting through a night so deep that all color vanished. John listened, arms folded over his chest. Her visions had guided him before, though not always with pleasant outcomes. He could never forget the tragedies that had marked Stannis' attempt to fulfill the same prophecy. "What does it mean?" Sansa asked quietly, her expression poised but tense. Melisandre's eyes flickered to John as she answered, "It means the time is near." John wanted to scoff at the cryptic nature of her words, but a shiver ran down his spine, as if an invisible hand had traced it. The cold was seeping in, thicker and more oppressive than mere weather. He thought back to the reports that had come in earlier. Small bands of white spotted in the forests near the last hearth, entire villages raised in the eastern foothills. The Night King's forces were no longer idle. This was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and the cat had begun to pounce. He excused himself from the group, feeling a sudden need for solitude. Climbing a winding corridor, he made his way to a small chapel within the castle walls, dedicated to the old gods and the new. It was quieter here, the hush of ancient stones allowing him to collect his thoughts. Light from the high windows cast pale diamonds across the floor. A single wooden bench faced an altar of plain wood and rough cloth. John sat, bowing his head, not entirely sure to whom he prayed. He had never been a devout man, not in the way Melisandre desired, nor even the way some northerners honored the old gods in the weirwood groves. Yet he felt compelled to seek solace in this stillness, to unburden himself of the swirling questions in his mind. Memory was a fickle companion, and it delivered him to moments both cherished and painful. His brief, harrowing relationship with Ygritte, the aching loss of so many brothers of the Night's Watch, the betrayal that had taken his life and thrust him into some semblance of rebirth. He had been dead once. He wondered what that made him now. A living man touched by death, or something else entirely. Melisandre claimed such experiences were the sign of Azor Ahai, who would be reborn amidst salt and smoke. If that were true, why did he feel just as mortal as everyone else around him? Yet beneath the surface of his doubts, a spark of warmth flickered, a faint ember of conviction. For all the darkness that surrounded them, John believed in the essential possibility of victory, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He had lived too long in hopelessness to give in to it willingly now. With a slow intake of breath, he rose from his seat and pressed a hand to the hilt of Longclaw at his side. The Valyrian steel blade had seen him through horrors he once thought unimaginable. Perhaps it was enough to keep going, to fight because giving up was not an option. Prophecy be damned, he thought to himself as he left the chapel. I will do what I must, or die trying. He stepped back into the corridor, only to nearly collide with Arya. His sister, no cousin, though it still felt odd to consider that technicality, peered at him, sharp-eyed as ever. Arya had changed drastically from the girl who once pestered him for archery lessons. There was a quiet deadliness to her now. the softness of childhood replaced by the steel of someone who had seen too much. But there was love in her eyes too, a familial bond that transcended blood and secrets. She said nothing, only studied his expression with a subtle tilt of her head. "I'm all right," John said softly, though the words felt hollow. Arya nodded. She wasn't one to pry, and in that moment John was grateful for her restraint. He mustered a thin smile. "We'll talk later," he promised. And she simply patted him on the arm before stepping aside to let him pass. The rest of the day blurred into a series of urgent tasks. He conducted a brief inspection of the castle walls to ensure the ramparts were fortified. He consulted with Davos on supply routes, confirming that additional wagons carrying wheat and salted fish were indeed delayed by the harsh weather. He met with a handful of Glovers and Serwins who offered additional support in the form of archers. Each small victory felt overshadowed by the approaching darkness. Every hour, new dispatches arrived from watchers on the wall. Fragments of coded messages that spoke of rising tensions. Sightings of whites in the open snow. The ephemeral glow of the Night King leading his dreadful entourage somewhere beyond the haunted forest. Night fell quickly in the north. The sky deepened from gray to indigo, then to an inky black spangled with a faint scattering of stars. Torches were lit in the courtyards, the watchfires on the battlements flaring up. Inside, men and women huddled around hearths, sharing stories of battles past and sipping mulled wine for warmth. John found little appetite that evening, but he made an appearance in the great hall, taking his seat at the high table beside Sansa out of duty more than desire. The meal was simple: roasted onions, boiled potatoes, and thin cuts of mutton. Yet the tension gave even the most modest of fare a bittersweet flavor. Everywhere he looked, he saw eyes brimming with hope and dread, as though the people knew they danced on the edge of a precipice. After the meal, John retreated once more, climbing a flight of stairs that led to the highest point of Winterfell's ramparts. From there, the entire castle spread below him, a labyrinth of roofs and courtyards, the warm glow of torchlight against the cold dark. In the distance, the expanse of the northern wilderness stretched on, mostly swallowed by the night's gloom. He stood, half lost in thought, when a soft footfall behind him broke his reverie. It was Melisandre again, silent as a cat in the shadows. The cold wind caught the edges of her crimson cloak, making it flutter around her like a living flame. "You will not sleep tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. John exhaled, the ghost of his breath drifting into the night. "I doubt many of us will." She stepped closer. In the moonlight, her face took on a pale cast, accentuating the lines that ran beneath her eyes. "We will need your strength soon," she said. "The dead are moving faster than we anticipated." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know," he said quietly. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. "I once told you that you have a part to play in this war. I believe you know it in your heart. The Lord of Light has chosen you. You have been tempered by ice and by fire. You have died and risen. You have led wildlings and lords alike. You are Azor Ahai." John did not turn to face her. Instead, his eyes lingered on the distant darkness, as though he might glimpse the supernatural host approaching. He could almost imagine it. A silent column of frost-shrouded figures, a host of whites with vacant eyes, and at their head, the Night King astride his undead steed. The image made his blood run cold. A small part of him wanted to reject Melisandre's words outright. Another part, perhaps braver or more foolish, wanted to believe he might indeed be the one to end this nightmare. "Prophecies can mislead," John said, finally turning to her. "Many died believing Stannis Baratheon was the one. I can't bear the thought of leading more people to their graves because of a story written in flames." "No." She studied him with an intensity he found unsettling. Her lips parted to speak, but she hesitated. "The flames can be difficult to interpret," she conceded. "Yet you are different. The magic that brought you back from the void is not easily bestowed. The living fire that courses through you is proof enough." He glanced down at the pommel of Longclaw, the snarling direwolf carved into the silver. The Valyrian steel had saved him many times, but would it be enough against the Night King? And if the blade was to become Lightbringer, That fabled sword of Azor Ahai. What price would need to be paid to awaken its true power? The stories told that Azor Ahai sacrificed his beloved to fuel the sword's flame. John's heart clenched. There had been so much death already. Melisandre seemed to sense his turmoil. She did not push further, but withdrew, leaving him alone on the wall. His breath came in slow, ragged exhalations. Every choice he had ever made, whether to join the Night's Watch, whether to unite the wildlings and the Northerners, whether to trust a woman like Melisandre, felt like a stone added to the scale of fate. And fate, it seemed, was poised to deliver its final judgment. Much later, long after the fires below had dimmed, and the men-at-arms had drifted off to what little sleep they could manage, John remained vigilant at his post. The cold was a constant companion now, creeping into the marrow of his bones. But with it came a strange clarity, a sense that in the hush of the midnight wind, he could nearly hear the voice of his ancestors whispering words he could not quite decipher. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the swirl of sensations around him. The rustle of wind against the towers, the distant hoot of an owl, the quiet hush of snow settling on stone. In the morning, he descended to the courtyard. The first light of dawn was just clawing at the sky, painting it in delicate shades of pink and silver. Few souls were awake at that hour. Only the guards on night duty and a handful of insomniac blacksmiths, their hammers echoing in the crisp air. With measured steps, John approached the training grounds. He needed to keep his muscles sharp, to reacquaint himself with the weight of Longclaw in a setting that wasn't life or death. He removed his fur cloak, hung it on a nearby post, and began a series of drills, the blade whistling through the stillness. His feet found a steady rhythm on the packed snow. Slash, parry, feint auto. Again. The routine was as familiar as his own heartbeat. He pushed away thoughts of prophecy, ignoring the creeping sense of foreboding in the back of his mind. He focused solely on the sword, on the angle of each cut, on the subtle pivot of his hips as he spun. His breath plumed around him in little clouds, but he paid it no mind, letting the repetitive motion lull him into a semblance of calm. There was no past, no future, only the present moment. Him, the blade, and the cold dawn. He did not realize how long he had been practicing until a voice interrupted him. "You wear yourself out." It was Sir Davos, standing at the edge of the yard, arms crossed against the chill. The older man's eyes were kind but concerned. John slowed and lowered his sword, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Couldn't sleep," John admitted, breathing heavily. Davos nodded, stepping forward to study John. "None of us slept much," he said. "But you, especially. There's a burden on your shoulders, whether you want it or not. Don't forget that the best sword arm in the world can fail if the mind and spirit aren't rested." Nentermatwao. John sheathed Longclaw, letting the weight of Davos' words sink in. It was comforting in a way to know someone understood. Sir Davos might not believe in the prophecy or the Lord of Light, but he had faith in John, the man, which was sometimes the only faith that mattered. John offered him a tight smile in gratitude. The day that followed was marked by a growing urgency. New ravens arrived with stories of villages wiped off the map, of storms so fierce that entire caravans were lost. Lords who had once considered defecting or claiming neutrality now flocked to Winterfell's gates, carrying whatever meager forces they could muster. The courtyard had become a chaotic swirl of banners and heraldry, from the flayed man of House Bolton, now only seen on captive banners, reminders of a dark past, to the crests of lesser-known houses from the far corners of the north. Each group brought news of the dead, how they marched in unbroken lines, unstoppable and silent. As the sun climbed high, a council was called in the Great Hall. The chamber was crowded with lords, ladies, and representatives from across the north and beyond. Tormund and a few free folk stood near the back, restless but attentive. Ghost, Jones Direwolf, padded softly at his feet, eyes alert, every tense muscle ready to spring. The discussions were fraught. Some advocated for a preemptive strike, others insisted they hole up behind the walls, trusting the stout defenses of Winterfell to hold back the tide. Tormund snorted at the mention of walls, having grown up scaling the unscalable. But the debate raged on, with every side presenting dire predictions and uncertain outcomes. Through it all, Jon tried to keep his composure. But his mind drifted more than once. He could almost feel the cold breath of the Night King on the back of his neck. The notion of leading a great host north to meet the army of the dead was daunting, yet waiting for the dead to come to them felt equally hopeless. The men would grow complacent, fear would fester, and the siege could be devastating if the castle were surrounded by an unending horde of whites. Melisandre's words from the previous night buzzed in his mind. "You have been tempered by ice and fire. The Lord of Light has chosen you." Finally he raised a hand, silencing the discord. Eyes turned to him, waiting for direction. He spoke deliberately, the echo of his voice filling the hall. "We can't wait for the dead to surround us," he began, his tone grave. "But we also can't rush blindly into their jaws. We'll send out scouts in small, fast groups to probe their position, stay out of sight, gather what information they can, and return. If we can learn how many they are, and how quickly they move, we'll have a chance to set the battlefield on our terms." Some nodded in agreement, others looked uneasy, but no one contradicted him. The meeting eventually drew to a close, and plans were made to dispatch the scouts at first light. Jon lingered in the hall, feeling the weight of every decision pressing on him. Sansa approached, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. Their eyes met, and unspoken words passed between them. Of love, of fear, of the intangible bond that held House Stark together through centuries of strife. "You're doing what you must," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the shuffle of people exiting the chamber. Jon nodded, forcing a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "I hope so," he replied. "We can't afford a single mistake." When the hall finally cleared, Melisandre once again emerged from some corner, her red gown flowing around her like molten lava. She studied Jon as if she were reading his fate in the lines of his face. "You are taking steps toward your destiny," she said, her voice muted. "Soon, the flames will reveal more." He frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Must it always be about flames and prophecies, Melisandre? Men and women will die in the coming battle. They'll die believing I'm someone I'm not." She looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable. "You may not believe, but they do. And belief can be a powerful force, stronger than any fortress. Don't underestimate it." Jon had no retort. He merely sighed and turned away, leaving her to the hush of the near-empty hall. He began to climb the steps toward the quarters that had been prepared for him. With every footfall, he felt as though he were stepping closer to a fate that refused to be deferred. Yet the question remained, echoing in his thoughts like the caw of a distant raven. Was he truly Azor Ahai, or just a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a shield of hope? By the time dusk descended again, the temperature had plummeted further. The braziers lining Winterfell's walkways glowed fiercely, yet failed to dispel the creeping fingers of frost that crawled along the edges of the stones. Jon found himself drawn to a secluded parapet overlooking the courtyard, the same vantage he had occupied so many times before. He leaned against the stone, letting the wind whip his hair about his face. Below, soldiers and servants bustled in a frantic dance, organizing supplies, cleaning weapons, and trying in vain to maintain some semblance of order amidst the chaos. His gaze drifted beyond the castle walls, where the snowscape stretched to the horizon. A memory rose unbidden. That of standing on the wall, peering out at the endless waste of ice, feeling a profound sense of smallness before the raw, impersonal cruelty of nature. Now the feeling had returned, doubled by the knowledge that death itself was walking in that whiteness. He shuddered, thinking of the Night King's gaze, cold and merciless, as if the creature had stared into the darkest parts of Jon's soul and found them wanting. A quiet step behind him signaled the arrival of another. He turned, surprised to see Brienne of Tarth. Her armor gleamed even in the dim light, and despite the biting cold, she stood tall and unflinching. She offered him a small bow of her head. "Your Grace," she said, her voice resonating with quiet strength. "Sansa sent me to check on you." Jon gave a wry chuckle. "I'm all right." Another lie, perhaps, but what else was he to say? Brienne regarded him for a moment, her clear eyes searching his features. "I know what it's like to serve a prophecy," she said, recalling her oath to protect the Stark girls, and the many hardships she had endured in the name of honor and duty. "It can be a heavy load." Jon nodded, grateful for her empathy. If anyone understood the weight of vows, of shouldering a responsibility that might seem impossible, it was Brienne. She rested a gauntleted hand on the hilt of her sword and looked out over the snowfields with him. For a moment, neither spoke. Two figures against the cold wind, each carrying a burden of duty that defied simple explanation. Then she took her leave as quietly as she had come, allowing Jon to return to his thoughts. The night thickened. The moon, wan and tenuous, drifted across the sky, veiled by fast-moving clouds. Somewhere in the castle, a dog barked, then fell silent. Jon felt the prickling on the back of his neck again, the sense that even the air was watching. He wondered if the Night King felt the same tension, if the ancient other stood under a different sky, peering south with cold contempt, an army of dead men at his back. The idea weighed heavily on Jon's heart. Unable to find rest in the claustrophobic confines of his chambers, Jon drifted through Winterfell's corridors late into the night. He passed through storerooms stacked with barrels of salted meat, through a modest library where old Maester's writings gathered dust, and at last into a small courtyard ringed by battered statues. Centuries of snow and wind had eroded their features, leaving only hints of once proud knights and kings. In the center stood a single weirwood sapling, its bark as white as bone, a red face carved with a somber expression that watched him with carved eyes. He paused there, resting a hand on the trunk. The old ways lived in this wood, so it was said. Even though this tree was but a younger offshoot, it carried in its sap the memory of ancient gods. Jon closed his eyes, feeling the wind snake around him, slipping between armor and cloak. In that moment, he whispered a soft prayer. A prayer not for himself, but for all those who had gathered under the banners of the North, for the wildlings who had crossed the wall to join them, and for every innocent soul who knew not what was coming. The stillness that followed his whispered words was profound. It was as though the night itself held its breath, as though the gods, old and new, listened. A single snowflake drifted downward, landing on the back of his gloved hand. It sparkled in the moonlight for an instant, before melting into a tiny droplet of water. Salt and smoke, life and death, past and future. It all blurred into one unspoken vow in that silent courtyard. He stood there until the stiff ache in his limbs grew impossible to ignore. Then, as the darkest hours of the night stretched toward dawn, he returned to his chambers. The castle was eerily quiet, the torches burning low, corridors illuminated by just enough light to guide his steps. The door creaked as he let himself in. A small fire flickered in the fireplace, casting shadows on the walls. Ghost, who had been lying curled in a corner, lifted his head and let out a soft whine. Jon knelt beside the direwolf, running a hand through the thick white fur. "Soon, boy," Jon murmured, gazing into the reflection of flames in Ghost's eyes. "We'll face him soon." In the hush of that chamber, it felt like an oath, some unbreakable promise that bound him to the coming conflict. He managed to slip into a restless slumber just before dawn, only to be awakened by the commotion of the day's tasks. Outside, men were already assembling, preparing to depart on their scouting missions. Jon dressed quickly, strapping on his armor and throwing a heavy cloak over his shoulders. He met the scouts in the main courtyard, giving them final instructions. Keep low, move quickly, avoid open confrontation. Several of the free folk had volunteered, their experience navigating harsh terrain invaluable. Jon thanked them personally, gripping each hand in turn, meeting their eyes, hoping his sincerity would inspire the courage they would need. When they rode out, a flurry of white cloaked them almost immediately, as though the swirling snow had been waiting for them to leave the safety of the walls. Jon stood at the gate, watching until their figures vanished into the whiteness. He silently willed them success, knowing full well that many might never return. The mood in Winterfell was grim for the rest of that day, tension coiling tighter with each hour. Blacksmiths worked ceaselessly, forging new arrowheads, mending armor, shaping steel into lethal points. Women and men labored in the kitchens, salting and preserving meats. Some set up makeshift infirmaries, laying out linens and bandages in anticipation of the wounded who would inevitably come. That evening, as the castle prepared once more for another frigid night, Jon was summoned by Sansa to a smaller chamber off the great hall. A single candle flickered on a round wooden table. She was waiting there with Arya and Bran, the three Stark siblings. Though their brotherhood and sisterhood had become complicated by secrets and destinies, united in purpose. Bran's gaze was distant, as though part of him was somewhere else in time or space. Arya stood near the door, posture tense but resolute. Sansa gestured for Jon to join them at the table, and her voice was gentle when she spoke. "We need to talk about what happens if the scouts bring news we can't bear," she said, her eyes flicking to Arya and Bran. "We need to talk about the future. Our future and the North's." Jon swallowed. It felt as if he were standing on the edge of a chasm. He had been so focused on the immediate threat, on fulfilling whatever role he had to keep people safe, that he had scarcely considered what lay beyond. Did they have a future if the Night King advanced? He looked from Sansa's earnest expression to Arya's hardened resolve, to Bran's otherworldly calm. Despite the uncertainty, he felt an unexpected surge of warmth. Whatever the battles ahead, he had family by his side. Family that understood sacrifice in a way few did. Before he could respond, Bran spoke, his voice oddly resonant. "Whatever comes, we must stand together. The Night King, he's not just an enemy of the living. He's an embodiment of an ancient war, a war that goes beyond our mortal understanding. Jon, you have a role to play, and I have seen glimpses of it in my visions." A silence filled the small chamber, thick as the winter snows. Jon braced himself for more prophecies, more talk of destinies he did not want. But instead, Bran reached out and placed a hand atop Jon's. It was a simple gesture, but a potent one. Then Arya stepped closer, resting her hand on Jon's other arm. And Sansa, with a solemn nod, stood by his shoulder. A bond, unspoken yet unbreakable, was reaffirmed in that instant. No matter what transpired, they would face it together, as Starks. Even if Jon was a Targaryen in name, the wolf's blood pulsed in his veins. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that commitment settle on his shoulders in a way that was both comforting and devastating. Through the cracks in the shutters, night fell once more. The candle on the table dwindled to a stump, flickering valiantly against the darkness. Outside, the wind howled, an unearthly sound that rattled the windows and prowled through the halls. Jon's thoughts turned north again, to the men who had ridden out that morning, to the half-frozen roads, the impenetrable forests, and the relentless shadows that marched under the Night King's banner. Despite the love and faith that surrounded him in that small room, a tremor of dread spread through him. The final confrontation was coming, unstoppable as the turning of the seasons, and destiny, or prophecy, had singled him out as the key. He exhaled, meeting the eyes of his siblings. "Whatever the cost," he said, voice thick with emotion, "we'll see it through." They answered him not with words, but with a shared look that said everything needed. A look that forged a silent agreement. We do not bend. We do not break. We stand, as we always have. And so they stood together in the face of that howling wind. Four souls bound by the echoes of the past, and the promise of a future they could only dare to imagine. Jon stepped into the corridor, leaving the glow of that single candle behind him. The darkness felt oppressive, but not entirely devoid of hope. Each footstep was a beat of his heart, carrying him forward through the labyrinth of halls and staircases, until he reached his private chamber once more. He shut the door, leaning against it as Ghost padded up to him, pressing a cold nose into his hand. Jon looked down at the direwolf, managing a small smile. In Ghost's red eyes he saw unwavering loyalty, a reflection of his own determination. The night stretched on, sleep remaining elusive. Jon's mind spun with visions of battle, flashes of steel against ice, of an azure-eyed demon wreathed in swirling snow. Yet whenever he felt despair creep in, he recalled the press of his siblings' hands, the memory of Sansa's calm, Arius' fierce resolve, Brand's intangible knowledge. He remembered Devos' practicality, Tormund's loyalty, Brienne's steadfastness, the unwavering faith of Lyanna Mormont, and even the unsettling conviction of Melisandre's prophecies. Each of these souls was placing their trust in him, forging a tapestry of loyalty that spread across the north like a shield of defiance. He rose from his bed just before dawn, strapping on his sword belt once again, pulling on gloves lined with fur. He would continue to stand vigilant, continue to train, to plan, to lead, whatever the cost. Beyond the walls of Winterfell, a horror beyond imagination advanced. Yet here, within these stones, hearts still beat with the courage of the living. If he truly was Azor Ahai reborn, then let it be tested in the crucible of battle. If he was merely a man, he would still fight until his last breath for the people who looked to him. And in that determination, there was a spark, a faint glow that might one day become a blazing sword in the darkness. Outside, the first rays of the sun crept over the horizon, illuminating the snow with a blood-tinged light. Jon walked toward the training yard, where men were already assembling for another day of drills. The air was razor-sharp, but it carried a certain clarity, a promise that a new day had indeed come. He paused at the threshold of the yard, glancing back at the keep. The old banners of House Stark fluttered in the breeze, the direwolf emblem defiant against the winter sky. Jon inhaled the crisp air, bracing himself for the challenges ahead. The slow, patient turning of fate had begun, and he was at its center, whether he believed in prophecy or not. With that, he stepped forward, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the still morning. And so the long wait continued, each moment bringing them closer to the hour when the dead would come. But in that moment, in the fragile dawn light, Jon felt something stirring within him. An ember of resolve, a whisper of possibility. Call it Azor Ahai, call it duty, call it the stubbornness of the Stark blood in his veins. Whatever name it bore, it pulsed with the rhythm of his heartbeat, an unspoken vow that he would not falter. Not until the final blow was struck, and the last dawn was secured. He lifted Longclaw in his hand, and saluted the men who gathered. They looked to him, and he saw hope flicker in their tired eyes. The wind whispered across the yard, and Jon felt the faintest warmth on his face, as the sun rose a little higher. Somewhere far beyond their sight, the Night King stirred, guiding his legions onward. But here, on the cusp of the greatest conflict mankind had ever faced, Jon Snow stood unwavering, a sentinel of flesh and blood, and perhaps something more. The hours stretched before them, the tension growing with each passing minute. Yet in that tension, in the hush of Winterfell's courtyard at dawn, there was also the promise of a hero's path unfolding, slow as the relentless turning of the seasons, inevitable as the coming of winter and the hope of spring. Dawn arrived thin and pallid over the ramparts of Winterfell, painting the snow-laden courtyard in quiet shades of gray. A hush fell over the few soldiers and servants who were stirring at that early hour, their footsteps soft on icy ground. Jon stood by the eastern wall with Ghost beside him, observing how the first light set the sky aflame with pale gold. He tried to find a sense of peace in that new day, but the cold wind carrying down from the far north seemed to pierce his thoughts as well as his bones. He felt restless, as though the entire castle were holding its breath. The scouts who had ventured northward 2 days ago had yet to return, and with each passing hour, hope frayed at the edges. Though they had been instructed to stay swift and silent, to avoid any confrontation, Jon knew the Night King's domain offered no true mercy. The undead legion scoured those blizzard-blinded trails, and dread spread among the living with each new swirl of wind that might, for all anyone knew, be the breath of a wight. Jon slid a gloved hand over Ghost's ruff, taking comfort in the direwolf's calm presence. He glanced up at the wall walk, where a pair of sentries were stamping their feet to keep warm. They watched the horizon through narrow eye slits, each man struggling to see what might lurk in the swirling snowfall. Nothing yet, only the moan of wind racing over the towers. Jon did not speak as he turned away and headed for the training yard. He was first to arrive at the yard, the trampled snow forming a patchy rectangle between the wooden practice dummies. A few minutes later, Tormund Giantsbane trudged in, his flaming beard rimed with ice. He gave John a lopsided grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You couldn't sleep either, I see." John merely shook his head. Tormund gestured to one of the vacant weapons racks lining the yard, where swords of simple steel hung next to practice shields. He grabbed an iron-tipped staff from the rack and twirled it expertly. "Might as well warm the blood," Tormund muttered. "Standing still is as good as dying in this cold." John agreed in silence, choosing a wooden training sword that had been reinforced with strips of steel. Its weight reminded him of a real blade, but was more forgiving in a spar. He and Tormund circled each other slowly, boots scraping the frozen ground. A hush spread around them. No spectators yet, just the whisper of wind and the crunch of ice. When Tormund lunged, John parried, the crack of wood meeting iron echoing in the stillness. Blow followed blow, deliberate and measured, neither man wanting to risk a misstep on slick footing. They sparred in an almost meditative rhythm, forging a camaraderie that transcended spoken words. It lasted for several long minutes until they heard the creak of the gate leading into the yard. Arya stepped in, followed by Brienne. Both wore thick furs over leather and carried blades at their hips. Arya offered a small smile that looked far too serious for a girl of her years, while Brienne nodded politely to John and Tormund, apologizing for the interruption. "The hall is stirring," Brienne said, her breath puffing in white cloud. "We have word." John froze, lowering his practice sword. 1,000 scenarios flickered through his mind. Scouts returned, or not returned, a messenger from beyond the castle walls, or some new crisis brewing in the south. He urged Tormund to follow as they trekked swiftly across the yard. The prospect of news, good or ill, charged the morning air like a hidden current. Ghost trailed close, his red eyes scanning every corner. Once inside the great hall, John discovered Sir Davos and Sansa waiting near the high table, where a dusting of snow had blown in through the doorway. The older knight met Joan's gaze with a grave expression. "One of the scouts is back," Davos said quietly. "He arrived alone." John's stomach twisted. "Is he injured?" Sansa nodded. "He collapsed in the courtyard and was carried to Maester Wolkin's chambers." Her voice trembled with concern she strove to hide. "They say he's half frozen. He keeps muttering about the dead." John wasted no time. He pushed through the gathering crowd, weaving past cloaked figures who parted respectfully. Sansa walked beside him, her face set in grim determination. The corridors leading to the Maester's chambers felt darker than usual, as though the day's feeble light couldn't penetrate the gloom. A hush rippled through the onlookers who pressed themselves to the walls, giving their king in the north space to pass. When John reached the small stone room, he found the Maester bent over a figure lying upon a simple cot. The scout was shuddering violently, his lips cracked and rimmed with icicles. Wounds, shallow but numerous, crisscrossed his face and arms. Steam rose from a basin of hot water as the Maester used cloths to warm the man's skin. John recognized him as Murch, a wildling volunteer known for his keen eyesight. He'd been among those tasked with charting paths around the hills northeast of Last Hearth. Murch's eyes opened a fraction, bloodshot and desperate. He noticed John and tried to sit up, but the effort made him cough, rattling his entire body. "They're coming," he rasped, voice raw as if from screaming. "We saw. Oh gods, so many." Sansa bent low, speaking gently. "How far?" The scout's gaze flickered to her, then back to John. "Less than a day's ride north of us if they don't rest. 5,000, maybe more. White walkers at the flanks. I saw their eyes." He started shaking again, so fiercely that Maester Wolkin pressed him back down. "They took the others. Cut them down. I barely got away." John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. If Murch had encountered only a fraction of the undead host, it boded ill for the rest of the scouts. "Rest," he said quietly. "You've done your duty." The man's eyes fluttered, but he managed one final whisper. "The Night King. He was there, riding a horror. Dark wings, frost, and his breath caught, and the rest of his words tumbled into a fit of coughing." Maester Wolkin signaled for silence, carefully draping another layer of blankets over Murch's trembling form. Don and Sansa exchanged grim looks as they withdrew into the corridor, shutting the door gently behind them. Davos, Tormund, Arya, and Brienne lingered there, awaiting Jon's word. The tension was palpable, an unspoken dread that weighed on every face. Finally, Sansa broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they're that close, we need to prepare for a siege." Tormund's eyes flashed with a hint of his old bluster. "We can't wait for them to surround us. Once they do, we'll be picking them off the walls for days, until we run out of arrows. We need to meet them head on, or at least keep them from encircling us." Arya rested a hand on the hilt of her dagger. "That means leaving Winterfell and risking open ground. Is that wise?" Jon rubbed at the bridge of his nose, feeling the press of responsibility. Every choice seemed fraught with catastrophe. Meeting them outside Winterfell might give us a chance to reduce their numbers before they reach the walls. But if we fail, the castle could be taken from within. Yet if we stay here and do nothing, we're cornered. Davos stroked his beard in thought. "Our best bet may be to form a defensive ring around the castle. Some distance out in the fields. Cavalry on the flanks, archers within arrow range. We can use the open space to our advantage." Oh. They deliberated for several heartbeats, each voice tempered by the knowledge that it could be their last stand. Finally, Jon made his decision. "We'll assemble our forces on the eastern fields at dawn tomorrow. That gives us time to ready the catapults and fortify the perimeter with trenches. We'll set them alight if the Whites push too close. With luck, we'll draw as many of them as we can into a kill zone before they storm the gates." Sansa lifted her chin. "I'll rally the bannermen. We should also send word to those still en route. Tell them to move with haste or risk being cut off." "That's a mistake." Jon nodded in gratitude. "Do it." He turned to Davos. "Have the blacksmiths focus on dragonglass-tipped spears and arrows. We have enough of the raw material left, I hope?" Davos frowned. "We do, but barely. We'll need to ration them among our best archers." Tormund, arms crossed, offered a determined nod. "Better than nothing. The free folk will take positions where they fight best, scouts and skirmishers on the flanks." Jon placed a hand on Tormund's shoulder. The gesture spoke of trust and mutual respect, born from everything they had endured together. Then, with a swirl of cloaks, they moved off in different directions, each to fulfill their tasks. The corridor echoed with the hurried footsteps of men and women rushing to prepare for a battle that felt all too imminent. Jon caught Arya's gaze as she lingered near the maester's door, perhaps still thinking of the stricken scout who had witnessed horrors she could only imagine. She gave him a small, tight smile, then slipped away without a word. Brienne followed suit, determined to see Podrick and the rest of her makeshift guard well placed in the upcoming conflict. Alone for a moment in the flickering torchlight, Jon closed his eyes. Visions of an endless horde of Whites roamed behind his lids, the White Walkers standing tall and silent among them. And at their head, the Night King, blue eyes colder than any winter wind. The memory of Hardhome still haunted Jon, the unstoppable force of the dead, bearing down on the living. He swallowed hard. One day's ride, possibly less, and the dead would be here. He turned down the corridor, heading for his own chambers with urgency. He needed to speak to Melisandre, though he wasn't sure why. A part of him resisted the notion that some ancient prophecy could help him fight the unstoppable. Yet, if there was some hidden power in the sword he carried, in the blood that ran through his veins, maybe it was time to confront it fully. His boots echoed in the stone halls, passing men in battered armor hauling crates of dragonglass shards, old crossbows, and barrels of pitch. He found Melisandre in a quiet, disused library near the base of the first keep. She stood by a table where tattered manuscripts and scrolls were piled haphazardly, studying a single parchment by candlelight. Her red robes glowed in the flickering flame, and for a moment she seemed oddly serene, as if the chaos enveloping Winterfell was a distant murmur. She did not turn when Jon entered, but spoke in a soft voice that drifted in the dim air. "You've learned the dead approach," she said. "I saw it in the flames last night." Jon approached cautiously, feeling the hush press against his ears. "You knew." It came out more accusing than he intended. "Why didn't you warn us sooner?" She set the parchment down, turning to face him. In the candle's glow, her eyes shone with an unreadable intensity. The flames speak in riddles. I only saw shapes, dark silhouettes, a clash of ice and fire. But I do know this. The time has come for you to fulfill the destiny the Lord of Light has placed upon you. John felt a surge of impatience, a longing to push aside prophecy and speak plainly. Thousands are about to die. We need tactics, not riddles. He stepped closer, the desk separating them like a boundary between pragmatism and faith. If I am indeed Azor Ahai, tell me how I'm supposed to stop him. Is there some secret hidden in these scrolls? Or must I repeat the legend and sacrifice someone I love to awaken my sword's flame? Her lips curved into the faintest of grim smiles. The legends tell of Nissa. Yes, and the sword Lightbringer was born in her heart's blood. But legends can be mere echoes of truth, distorted by time. The path to forging Lightbringer may not be the same as it was ages ago. Still, sacrifice is a part of magic, a crucial part. That much I cannot deny. Then, he felt the weight of those words press into his chest. Memories of all he had lost, Ygritte, the brothers of the Night's Watch, even the childhood he never fully had, rose like ghosts. Too many have died already. I can't ask for more. Not in the name of some prophecy. Melisandre's eyes glistened as the candles sputtered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. We all choose our sacrifices, Jon Snow. The question is whether yours will be enough to bring forth the dawn. She set a hand upon the parchment, which was filled with strange runes and half-faded diagrams. I've been studying the texts. There may be another way. An invocation to the Lord of Light, fueled by fire and blood. If performed at the right moment, it could imbue your blade with the force of living flame without repeating the ancient tragedy. But it is dangerous, uncertain. The cost could still be high. Jon swallowed, grappling with her words. Outside, the frantic world of Winterfell demanded immediate practicalities. Gathering troops, forging weapons, laying defenses. Here, Melisandre offered a glimpse of something beyond mortal means. A power that might tip the scales if used correctly, or destroy them all if misused. He braced his hands on the edge of the table, meeting her steady gaze. "Tell me what to do when the time comes," he said at last, voice low. "We'll try your ceremony if we have no other choice." She inclined her head, the candlelight glimmering in her hair. "I will be ready." Jon left her to her parchments and stepped into the hallway, feeling an odd mix of relief and dread. Sacrifice, he thought again. He could only hope that any blood spilled for the sake of magic would be his own, and not someone else. He strode toward the courtyard, passing guards who saluted him. The sky outside was thick with gray, the sun struggling to shine through an ever-present veil of cloud. Within the hour, Sansa had assembled a war council in the main hall, a condensed meeting for the highest-ranking lords, the key advisors, and the knights who led each battalion. Jon took his seat at the head of the long table, ghost settling at his feet. Sansa began by recounting the intelligence gleaned from the one surviving scout. The tension in the room was stifling. The lords of the north, tall, bearded men in patchwork furs, each representing a different corner of the frozen territory, exchanged worried glances. Lyanna Mormont, diminutive but fierce, stood near the table's far corner, her face set in hardened resolve that belied her years. Tormund, arms folded, leaned against a pillar, while Davos hovered by Jon's side, ready to offer counsel. Jon repeated the plan. Meet the Night King's army on the open fields east of Winterfell before they could fully encircle the castle. Fight them in waves, drawing them into carefully placed traps of flaming trenches, dragonglass stakes, and arrow volleys. The atmosphere in the hall prickled with uncertainty, but no one had a better suggestion. They all knew the single advantage the living had was their ability to coordinate and adapt. Even so, it felt like charging into the maw of doom. One by one, the lords swore their arms. The Serwyns, the Glovers, the Tallhearts, and others whose banners had arrived from scattered corners of the north. Each promised men-at-arms, archers, and horsemen. Many lords spoke with bravado about how their lineages stretched back centuries, how they had stood with the kings of winter in the age of legends. Yet when their voices wavered, it was clear they all understood this might be their last stand. As the meeting concluded, Jon rose. "Rest well," he told them. "We ride out at first light. May the gods, old and new, protect us all." With that, they dispersed into the corridors, each returning to their men to ensure final preparations were made. Jon remained in the hall a little longer, joined by Sansa, Davos, and Tormund. Silence weighed on them until at last Tormund cleared his throat. "We're all in this together," he said, glancing at each face in turn. "Let's make the Night King choke on his own ice." Sansa exhaled, attempting a faint smile. "That's the spirit," she said wryly, though worry lined her brow. She turned to Jon, her voice soft. "I'll look after everything inside the castle. Civilian supplies, the wounded. But I have no intention of hiding away. Once the main line engages, I'll command from the walls if needed." Jon looked at her, feeling that familiar surge of protectiveness. But he knew better than to challenge her determination. Sansa had proved her capabilities time and again. He nodded. "Stay safe, as best you can." She gave him a knowing look. "You too." Then she excused herself, the echoes of her footsteps trailing into the corridor. Davos paused, adjusting the glove on his missing fingertips. "I've seen battles, my lord, but none like this. I'll be at your side, for what it's worth." Jon placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "It's worth a great deal." Tormund thumped his chest. "We'll give those dead men a fight they won't forget, even if they don't remember anything at all." The humor in his voice was forced, but it brought a moment of levity to the grim atmosphere. They parted ways, and Jon ventured again into the growing twilight. The day had vanished in a blur of plans and hurried preparations. The sky above bore the red and gold of a dying sun, casting a strange glow across Winterfell's towers. Soldiers and knights rushed to stoke braziers and carry last-minute supplies to the outer walls. The clang of hammers rang from the forges where blacksmiths labored relentlessly, forging arrowheads from dragonglass shards. Everywhere Jon looked, he witnessed the final hours before a storm. A hush broken by shouts and the brisk march of boots over icy stone. He made it his way to the ramparts, climbing the worn steps two at a time until he reached a vantage point overlooking the eastern fields. From that height, he could see an expanse of snow stretching into the distance, broken by a few knolls and stands of dead trees. Tomorrow, that plain would be a battlefield. He thought back to all the battles he had seen. The chaos at Castle Black, the desperation at Hardhome, the carnage of the bastards. But none compared to this. If they failed here, the entire realm would be lost to the cold grip of Undeath. A swirl of movement caught his eye. Bran, seated in a wheeled chair near one of the parapets, with Arya standing close by. Jon quietly joined them, the wind ruffling his cloak. He glanced down at Bran, whose distant gaze roamed the horizon. "Anything?" Jon asked softly, knowing Bran's vision sometimes transcended walls and distances. Bran's voice was subdued, as if echoing from a deep place. "They are coming. They move by night, tireless, unstoppable. The Night King. He is closer than you think." Arya's hand tightened on the carved handle of Bran's chair. "Is there anything you can do? Warg into a raven, see their numbers?" Bran blinked, returning to himself. "I could, yes. But we already know they come in vast numbers. The visions show something else. A final confrontation in darkness, shapes of ice and fire struggling for the future of all." His eyes flickered up to Jon. "It's you I see, Jon, at the center of it." Jon inhaled the sharp night air, feeling that now familiar pang. "Prophecy," he whispered, glancing at Arya. She locked eyes with him, an unspoken vow passing between them. Whatever his role, he was not alone. "I'll keep him safe," Arya said with quiet fierceness, stepping back to stand guard over her brother. Bran merely offered a faint nod of acceptance. Jon's chest felt tight. He did not doubt Arya's skill. He had witnessed it firsthand. But the might of the undead host was something else entirely. He could only pray that by dawn's light, their defenses would be strong enough to hold. With a final clasp of Arya's hand and a reassuring squeeze of Bran's shoulder, Jon turned away, descending the steps once again. The great hall had been transformed into a staging ground of sorts. The tables were pushed aside, replaced by racks of spears and lines of shields. A handful of cooks still served simple stews to those who had just come off watch duty, but the main focus was the distribution of arms. Plate-clad knights inspected dragon-glass daggers, muttering about how they had never seen such weapons. A group of wildlings tested the edges of newly forged spears. Here and there, men warmed their hands around braziers, occasionally sharing a grim joke to mask their fear. Jon moved among them, offering words of encouragement. Though he was no great orator, the soldiers took heart in his presence. They had heard tales of the king in the north who had died and been resurrected, the man who united wildlings and Northmen alike against a common threat. Some believed wholeheartedly that he was Azor Ahai reborn. Others scoffed at prophecy, but believed in Jon Snow, the man who had proven his courage. As he passed, men bowed their heads or murmured, "Your Grace." Women who had joined the fight, wives, daughters, and sisters of knights who refused to sit idle, looked at him with solemn determination. He felt the collective weight of their faith pressing upon him, and it steeled his resolve. Near the entrance to the kitchens, he encountered Gilly and Samwell Tarly, who had arrived from the Citadel only a few days prior. Sam had an armful of scrolls clutched protectively to his chest, while Gilly tried to calm little Sam, who squirmed restlessly. "Jon," Sam greeted, relief evident in his voice. "I've been scouring every record I can find on the long night. There are mentions, scattered references really, to special wards. Some kind of runic circles that might slow the dead. But the instructions are incomplete, and we were short on time." "Narvin? Wani?" Jon laid a hand on Sam's shoulder, appreciating his friend's unwavering quest for knowledge. "Thank you, Sam. Even if we can't craft new wards, anything that helps us understand the enemy is valuable. There's always a chance something in those records might give us an edge." Sam nodded, though he looked uncertain. "I'll keep looking. Maybe there's a mention of how Azor Ahai truly awakened Lightbringer. He paused, catching himself. "I'm not saying it has to be you, but if the prophecy's even half right." Jon offered a weary smile, recalling Melisandre's words. "We'll see. For now, get Gilly and the baby somewhere safe once the battle begins. The crypts might not be as secure as we'd like, but it's still safer than the walls." Gilly looked at Jon with earnest gratitude. "Stay safe out there," she said softly, holding little Sam close. Jon squeezed her hand gently, then moved on, letting them finish their preparations. The hours bled into one another as night pressed down on Winterfell. The temperature plummeted, turning the very air to ice. Torches crackled along the battlements, their flames dancing in gusts of wind, and patrols of watchmen peered anxiously out into the darkness. Jon stood on the rampart, scanning the fields with a heavy heart. Despite the brazier placed behind him, the cold sank through his furs, settling like a lead weight in his chest. Each exhalation formed a ghostly cloud that drifted over the wall's edge, lost in the void beyond. He found no sleep that night. Instead, he patrolled the walls, checking in on the men stationed at each tower, nodding to archers who stamped their feet to ward off numbness. Sometimes, he paused to stare into the blackness, trying to discern shapes in the swirling snow. It was easy to imagine a legion of wights lurking just beyond sight, creeping closer with every frozen gust. Shortly before dawn, the sky in the east began to lighten, a subtle shift from pitch black to steel gray. The courtyard came alive with renewed urgency. Men donned armor, strapped on swords, and formed into ranks. Horses whinnied as stable hands led them onto the packed snow outside the gates, breath steaming in the pre-dawn chill. The snap of banners sounded in the wind, though which banners these were hardly mattered now. Stark, Glover, Mormont, Serwyn, free folk. All bled into one alliance, a single cause: survival. Jon mustered his forces at the castle gates, mounted on a dark warhorse that pawed at the ground. Ghost trotted at the horse's flank, silent and watchful. Sansa stood near the portcullis, offering last-minute instructions to the stewards, ensuring the wounded would have places to be treated if they returned. She wore a heavy cloak lined with dire wolf fur, her hair braided tightly, no longer the gentle lady but a resolute commander in her own right. Jon rode up beside her. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes. In the hush before the gates opened, he reached out and clasped her hand. "You know what to do if the lines break." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I do." He didn't voice the possibility that they might never see each other again. Instead, he let go, his hand lingering on her gloved fingers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then, with a grim set to his jaw, Jon lifted a hand to signal the advance. The portcullis clanked upward. The mighty doors groaned, and the first column of cavalry moved into the cold gray dawn. They formed on the plain east of Winterfell, near a low rise that gave them some elevation over the surrounding fields. Snow crunched under hooves and boots, forming a ragged chorus that traveled strangely in the morning stillness. Puffs of breath rose from men and horses alike, blending with the low-ground mist that clung to the earth. The chill nipped at every exposed patch of skin, but no one complained. Fear kept them alert, more potent than any warm cloak could be. From atop his horse, Jon surveyed the front line. Tormund commanded a group of wildling spearwives and axemen on the left flank, while the Northman cavalry formed a wedge at the center, ready to charge. Behind them stood ranks of pikemen and archers, the latter armed with quivers containing precious dragonglass-tipped arrows. Davos, wearing partial plate over thick furs, guided a portion of these archers on the right flank, near a makeshift barricade of sharpened stakes hammered into the frozen earth. They waited in that hush, hearts thundering as the sky brightened from gray to a sickly white. No birds sang, no wind sighed. It was as if nature itself hushed in anticipation of the horror to come. Then, faintly at first, they heard a sound like cracking ice. Jon's heart lurched. All along the line men shifted their grip on sword hilts, an uneasy ripple passing through them. A figure on horseback emerged from the gloom, galloping toward the living ranks, one of the outriders sent to keep watch. Jon's pulse raced as the rider arrived, face pale beneath his leather helm. "They're almost here," he gasped. "Marching from the northeast, thousands. The ground itself seems to move with them." Jon locked eyes with Tormund, who nodded grimly. With that, Jon drew Longclaw, raising it high. The steel caught a half-hearted ray of sunlight, glinting with a cold brightness. He drove the blade upward, and the signal horns blared. A deep, echoing note that rattled the nerves of every soul present. Archers stepped forward, knocking arrows, while the cavalry readied lances, hooves stamping the ground in a restless tattoo. The hush that followed was torn apart by a shrieking gale, as if the dead had exhaled a single breath of malevolence. A shape appeared on the horizon, a black mass that spread and shimmered, too numerous to comprehend. The whites moved in a relentless wave, unfeeling and silent, except for the scrape of bone and the rustle of rotted limbs. Their eyes glowed an unnatural blue. Among them, pale riders, white walkers perched upon the saddles of deathly steeds. At their center towered a figure on something monstrous, its form partly shrouded in blowing snow, but unmistakable in its aura of dread, the Night King. Jon swallowed, the dryness in his throat intensifying. If terror had a face, it was there in that unstoppable legion. A flicker of memory rose unbidden, a mass of corpses at Hardhome, reanimated with a chilling gesture of those icy arms. This was that force magnified tenfold, perhaps 100-fold, and it was all pinned on the living line that stretched across the field. Yet, a curious calm settled over Jon, some mixture of fatalism and resolve. He felt Ghost at his side, sensed the presence of allies on all flanks, and remembered Sansa behind the walls. He thought of Arya, Bran, and those innocents huddled in the crypts or overshadowed by the ramparts. Then he recalled Melisandre's words. "The time has come for you to fulfill the destiny." A surge of heat pulsed through him, despite the biting cold. He lowered Longclaw, pointed it toward the onrushing darkness. The horns blared once more, and with a raw cry that tore from the depths of his being, Jon signaled the charge. Horses thundered forward, men shouted, and the archers let fly their first volley of arrows. Dragonglass-tipped projectiles arced through the frigid sky before descending upon the leading ranks of the dead. Some whites collapsed where they stood, impaled by that lethal stone, but countless more scrambled over their fallen kin, heedless of harm. The cavalry slammed into the undead line with bone-jarring force. Steel rang, flesh tore, and screams mingled with a ghastly rattle of whites. John led the wedge, long claw cleaving into the first rank. Heads toppled, limbs flew. Each strike was a desperate thrust against futility. Yet the living pressed on. Ghost leapt among the rotting forms, jaws snapping. Tormund's war cry rose above the din, and somewhere to the right, Davos bellowed for the archers to loose again. It was chaos, a storm of bodies swirling in the haze of kicked-up snow. John's senses narrowed to each breath, each clash of blade against bone. He tried to keep a formation, tried to push forward rather than be engulfed, but the dead seemed endless. A white walker emerged, frost-white hair trailing in the wind, brandishing a blade that shimmered with ice. John spurred his horse toward it, longing to face a foe that could actually be slain by Valyrian steel. Their swords met in a crash of metal that sent a numbing jolt up John's arm. Sparks flew where ice clashed with ancient steel, and the walker's eerie blue eyes glared with an alien hatred. Again and again, they traded blows, the shrieks of the undead forming a wild cacophony around them. John grit his teeth, focusing on the White Walker's movements, that uncanny grace that belied its unnatural form. At last, he saw an opening and lunged, driving Longclaw into the walker's torso. The creature burst in a swirl of ice shards that scattered at Joan's feet. He gasped for breath, searching for the next threat, sweat mingling with the freezing air. All around him the living fought desperately, forming pockets of resistance as the dead pressed in. The flaming trenches had been lit, but many whites simply threw themselves into the flames, extinguishing them with their own corpses and allowing others to surge across. Catapults hurled barrels of pitch that erupted in pyres of orange flame, casting the battlefield in wavering light. The snow grew tinged with ash and gore, swirling in eddies of scorching and freezing air alike. After an indeterminable stretch of savage fighting, John found himself pushed back, the press of undead bodies forcing the living to yield ground. He realized with dread that they were being driven closer and closer to the castle walls. The cavalry wedge had dissolved into ragged clusters, each man struggling to keep from being overwhelmed. Ears ringing from the shrieks, lungs burning from the cold, John slashed through another wave of whites that lunged at him with a mindless fury. In the flicker of flame and ice, he glimpsed Tormund grappling with a pale figure, burying an axe into its skull before it dissolved. Davos, battered and stained with black blood, guided a knot of archers who fired at near point-blank range, trying to thin the horde that hammered at them. Far behind, the walls of Winterfell stood tall but distant, their gates flung wide to allow retreating soldiers back inside. If those gates closed too soon, half their forces would be locked out, left to be devoured. Joan's horse took a spear to its flank from a rabid white, and the animal collapsed in a shriek of pain, throwing John violently to the ground. He rolled onto his side, snow caking his beard, the wind momentarily knocked from him. A swarm of undead eyes flicked in his direction, drawn by the movement. Clutching Longclaw, he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the screaming agony in his shoulder. A pair of whites lunged, skeletal jaws snapping. He decapitated the first with a desperate swing, then reversed his grip and stabbed the second through the chest. Both fell lifelessly, but more crawled over them, snarling with inhuman hunger. John braced himself, preparing to face that onslaught alone. But then a high-pitched battle cry split the air, and a slender figure intervened, leaping into the fray. Ari's blade flashed, her movements too swift for the whites to counter. She slipped between the undead like a shadow, each stroke of her steel striking fatal blow after fatal blow. For a moment, brother and sister stood back to back, holding off the tide. "We have to fall back," she hissed, parrying an upraised claw. Sansa gave the order. "Everyone is retreating inside the walls." John nodded, panting. He cast a quick glance over the chaos, confirming that the lines were indeed broken, pockets of men racing back toward Winterfell. Flaming barricades flickered out as whites clambered over them, unstoppable. The living had no choice but to retreat. He guided Arya toward a cluster of knights struggling to keep a path open. Together, they carved a narrow route back, over ground choked with broken bodies and half buried in swirling drifts. The fortress loomed ahead, torches blazing at the gate. An arrow whistled past Jon's ear, burying itself into a white that lunged from the flank. He nodded thanks to the archer perched on Winterfell's wall, then continued forward, step by agonizing step. His shoulder ached, but adrenaline kept him moving. Arya was a blur of lethal motion, cutting down any wight foolish enough to come within her range. Finally they stumbled through the gate, half carrying a wounded soldier whose legs had buckled beneath him. Inside the walls, the courtyard was mayhem. Soldiers poured in from every entrance, many of them bleeding or limping. Horses screamed, rearing and kicking in panic. Groups of fighters quickly formed barricades behind the gate, dragging wagons and crates to create a last line of defense. Archers on the walls launched volley after volley into the mass of undead that pressed toward the gates. The hiss of flames and the reek of singed hair filled the air. Somewhere, Jon heard Sansa calling for healers, her voice high but unwavering. He saw Gendry dash by with a hammer over his shoulder, heading for another portion of the ramparts. Lyanna Mormont barked commands at a handful of men who had lost their commanding officer in the chaos. The defenders scrambled to hold on, though the battered men from the field looked ready to collapse. Ghost appeared at Jon's side, tail bristling, muzzle smeared with black fluids. Jon almost choked with relief at the sight of his direwolf alive. A second later, Tormund stumbled through the gates, swatting away clinging wights with a savage roar. Davos and Brienne followed, each helping a gravely wounded soldier cross the threshold. When at last the gates were slammed shut, the clang reverberated throughout Winterfell, echoing an ominous note of finality. The living were sealed inside. The dead hammered at the other side, scratching, shrieking, and prying at the timbers. Jon slumped against the wall, chest heaving, heart pounding so hard it threatened to burst. Despite everything, he was alive. For now, so were his most trusted allies. But the ground beyond the walls was lost, littered with bodies of the fallen, living and dead alike. He could still hear the screeches of the wights, their relentless assault pounding like a drumbeat. Then, between one breath and the next, an eerie silence fell across the courtyard. The shrieks and moans outside continued, but within the walls, men paused to catch what breath they could. The moment felt suspended, a brief lull in a nightmare that had no end. Jon glanced around at the ashen faces, the trembling limbs, the eyes that flickered with battle shock. He knew the worst was yet to come. A soldier, a youth with a gash on his brow, staggered up to Jon. "The Night King," he rasped, voice trembling. "He is out there. I saw. A beast of darkness in the sky." Jon's stomach nodded. The mention of the undead dragon, or some monstrous thing, made his heart pound anew. The Night King was indeed close, and that meant the final confrontation approached with every passing breath. In that fleeting moment of respite, he thought of Melisandre's words again. The time may come when Lightbringer must truly be born, or they'd be swallowed by the endless night. He pushed off the wall, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Around him, the living regrouped, battered, but not yet broken. Archers scrambled up the battlements, dragging wounded limbs. Spearmen readied themselves in the courtyard, setting shields at the ready. Someone doused the flames in a brazier, then lit another. The swirl of smoke stung Jon's eyes, but his vision sharpened with grim purpose. As he gazed at the battered gate, battered men, battered hearts, a single thought pulsed in his mind like a drumbeat. They will breach these walls soon if we do nothing. It was time to face what prophecy, chance, or cruel destiny had laid at his feet. If he truly was Azor Ahai, if that power could be unleashed, he had to seize it now, or watch Winterfell drown in blood and ice. He felt a tremor in his core. Not fear alone, but a fierce determination. The dead were here. No more waiting, no more doubts. He turned to the men, Northmen, free folk, knights, all those who had placed their hope in him. He gripped Longclaw, the worn leather familiar in his hand, and raised his voice over the clamor. "We hold Winterfell!" he shouted, forcing every ounce of conviction he had into those words. "No matter what comes, A ragged cheer rose, though it was drenched in exhaustion and dread. Still, it was enough. Men and women repositioned themselves, tightening ranks. Ghost let out a low growl, pacing near John's boots, as if sensing a cataclysm at hand. Beyond the walls, the hammering on the gate redoubled, and all eyes darted to the timbers, which groaned under the strain. Something massive struck with terrible force, splitting a crack through the wood. The defenders braced themselves, hearts pounding in unison. The final stand was at hand, whether they were ready or not. John lifted Longclaw, eyes set on the gate. Each breath came swift and cold. Amid the swirling chaos of flame and shadow, he felt a stirring inside, a faint ember of power that did not belong solely to him. Perhaps it was the essence of the Red God, or the defiance of the old gods in this land. Perhaps it was merely the love and courage of those who stood at his side. Whatever its source, it burned brighter in him now than at any moment before. Tomorrow, or perhaps even within the next hour, the fate of the living would be decided. He steeled himself. If destiny demanded that he be Azor or Ahai, then so be it. He would fight until the last breath for those who believed in him. Outside, the whites shrieked like a wind through a graveyard, and the gate began to buckle. Jon Snow, king in the north, stood in the courtyard of Winterfell with allies at his back, and a sword in his hand, waiting for the final onslaught. No prophecy could stand in for courage, only the will to fight on against all odds. And so he gripped Longclaw tight, preparing for the moment when steel and ice would clash under a sky that held no mercy. Endgame. The courtyard shuddered with impact after impact against the main gate, the thick timbers cracking under the relentless assault. Men and women of the north braced themselves behind improvised barricades, each heart pounding as if it might tear free of its ribcage. Black blood and soot clung to their armor. Their breath emerged in ragged gasps. Snow drifted in swirling eddies from the ramparts, mingling with the thick smoke of the pitch fires still smoldering beyond the walls. All eyes remained fixed on the sagging gate, a bulging shape in the wood that threatened to give way at any moment. Jon clenched Longclaw, his knuckles bone white beneath the worn leather of his gloves. The pain in his shoulder flared each time he drew breath, yet the surge of adrenaline dulled it enough that he could stand upright, holding his ground at the center of the yard. Nearby, Arya cradled a crossbow she had claimed from a fallen archer, a fresh quiver strapped across her back. Even from a short distance, Jon could see the tension in her posture. The same fierce readiness he'd seen in her the day she'd sparred with Brienne in the quiet of the castle's courtyard. Now the stakes were unimaginably higher. A keening cry echoed from beyond the walls. It rose above the clamor of the dead, piercing the din like a shard of ice through flesh. Soldiers tightened their grips on spears. A few exchanged frightened looks. They knew that cry too well. It belonged to no mortal beast. Something far larger and deadlier stirred on the other side of the gate. A hush moved across the defenders. A ripple of dread felt in every heartbeat. In that awful silence, Melisandre stepped forward from the shadows of the yard. Crimson fabric clung to her form, the swirling wind tossing her red hair as though it were living flame. The scars of exhaustion lay beneath her eyes, but she moved with an air of purpose, as though propelled by a force invisible to all others. She carried no sword, only a slender staff topped with a carved ruby that flickered like an ember in the gloom. She stopped close to Jon, her expression alight with unspoken urgency. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, her voice low, carrying an undercurrent of trembling energy. "The Night King is near. The dead are converging on us like moths to a flame." Jon's gaze remained on the failing gate. He could sense it too, a presence colder than winter itself, pressing on the very air. "What can we do?" he demanded in a voice tight with desperation. "They'll breach the wall soon." Her eyes flickered to the sword in his hand, and something like a grim smile twitched at her lips. "There may be no more time to wait. We must attempt the invocation before the gate falls, unless you wish to face the Night King in pure steel, with no power but your own." Jon almost grimaced. He recalled their conversation in the library, the possibility of awakening the blade with some mystical power. A conjuration that might replicate Lightbringer without the ancient tragedy of sacrificing a loved one. The very idea had filled him with unease. Yet the hush of the courtyard, the battered soldiers, and the pounding at the gate made the alternative seem far worse. "How?" he asked hoarsely. Melisandre's expression grew taut. "We need a circle of flame and an offering of blood. Your blood." She paused, eyes flicking toward a small patch of open ground behind the barricades. "You must stand at the center while I chant. The sword must be bared, and you must be willing to endure whatever the Lord of Light demands." He swallowed, thinking of the thousands of souls counting on him. Their lives hung in a precarious balance. As much as he feared what this ritual might entail, he feared defeat far more. "Do it," he said at last, the words coming out in a sharp exhalation. "But be quick." Melisandre nodded, her eyes glinting with something akin to relief. She beckoned to a cluster of soldiers who had paused to regroup. "Clear a space," she commanded, her voice carrying with unexpected power. "Bring torches. Form a ring, swiftly now." They, too shaken and weary for questions, hurried to comply, heaving aside broken wagons, fallen beams, and frozen corpses that littered the yard. Jon turned to Arya, finding her gaze intent upon him. "Cover us," he said, though he wanted to say far more, that he trusted her, that he was proud of her, that if the worst happened, he wanted her to survive. But no such sentiments found his tongue. "Make sure no white gets through." She nodded, dark hair whipping in the wind, her eyes resolute. "I will." Then she sprinted off, urging others to join her in fortifying the courtyard's perimeter around this makeshift ritual site. Soon, a ring of torches blazed in a hasty circle, each torch set into the snowy ground and propped by stones or lodged in the broken timbers. The firelight revealed the battered state of Winterfell's defenders. Smoke wafted in twisting columns overhead, merging with the stormy sky. Melisandre stood at the circle's center, motioning for Jon to join her. Outside the ring, Tormund, Davos, and several others formed a protective line. Armed with swords, spears, and dragonglass-tipped pikes, Brienne and Podrick set shields near the front, ready to repel any intruders. The courtyard walls loomed on all sides, flickering with the light of braziers and torches. High above, the ramparts bristled with archers who drew their bowstrings taut, prepared for whatever might happen when the gate gave way. Jon stepped inside the circle, the torch flames dancing around him. The heat was palpable against his cheeks, yet the air still felt deathly cold. Melisandre's voice rose in a chant, low and melodic, in a language older than any maester's records. The sound rolled through the courtyard like an undercurrent of thunder. A curious hush settled over the defenders, some of whom looked on with mingled hope and unease. Jon raised Longclaw, holding it horizontally before him. The swirling shapes in the steel caught the torchlight. He tried not to think too hard about what came next, focusing on the memory of those he fought for. Sansa and Bran, within these very walls, Arya out there on the barricade, Ghost prowling the perimeter, Tormund's unyielding loyalty, Davos' steady presence, the proud northern houses that had rallied under the Stark banner, the wildlings who had come south for a chance at life, Sam and Gilly, and the child who knew next to nothing of war but already... If there was any chance this invocation could turn the tide, he had to take it. Melisandre's chant intensified, her voice rising in pitch. The torches in the circle's perimeter flared unnaturally, as though fed by some invisible wind. She withdrew a small knife, its hilt inlaid with rubies that glowed like tiny hearts. Jon's pulse kicked, but he kept still, recalling that blood would be required to fuel the magic. She gestured for him to offer his hand, and he complied, extending his left wrist. With deft precision, she made a shallow cut across his forearm, just enough to let blood well up in a vivid stream. "Press it to the steel," Melisandre commanded. Jon gritted his teeth, gripping Longclaw's blade. He smeared his blood along its length, feeling a jolt of pain as the cold metal stung the wound. The Red Woman's words rose in feverish intensity, echoing across the courtyard. The torches guttered, then exploded into pillars of flame that leapt higher than a man's head. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The ring of fire brightened until the circle resembled a blazing sun in the heart of Winterfell. Jon felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle, a tingling that coursed through his limbs. The sensation was neither entirely painful nor pleasant. It felt like a current of raw energy searing his veins. He tried to steady himself, but his legs wobbled under the sudden pressure, as if invisible hands were attempting to drag him into another realm. Flashes of memory tore through his mind. The moment he rose from death, the savage battle at Hardhome, the first time he had seen Ghost as a pup. Voices, half remembered, whispered in his ears. Some from the living, others perhaps from beyond the grave. A snarl erupted from beyond the gate, louder than any before it, accompanied by the thunderous crash of splintering wood. The gate was caving in. Nightmarish shapes poured through the gap, silhouettes contorted by the flickering glow of nearby fires. Shrieks filled the air, forcing the defenders to brace themselves. Tormund roared a warning, and archers on the walls let loose a volley of arrows. Jon heard it all, as if from a distance. His focus narrowed to the blade in his hands. Every muscle in his body tensed, locked in a silent struggle with the energy swirling through him. He felt as if a great wave of heat had ignited within his chest, a furnace roaring in a place once cold. His vision blurred. For an instant, he feared he would black out, that the power would consume him before he could wield it. Then Melisandre's voice cut through his panic, a single word in a language he did not understand, and the wave inside him broke. Longclaw erupted in flame. A swirl of fire ran from hilt to tip, bright as molten steel, dancing along the Valyrian blade without consuming it. Jon sucked in a breath, eyes wide, the light of the burning sword reflecting off the shocked faces of the defenders. For a heartbeat, the entire courtyard was cast in a fiery glow that banished the gloom. Melisandre's chant ceased, leaving only the roar of flame and the cacophony of battle near the gate. She staggered back, exhausted by the magic. One hand pressed to her temple. Sweat beaded across her brow despite the frigid wind. "It is done," she whispered, voice hoarse. "Lightbringer." Jon scarcely heard her. His mind was consumed by the raw power coursing through his arm. He could feel it connected to his heartbeat, responding to every breath. The fire on the sword's length blazed steadily, not diminishing, as though some reservoir of energy fueled it from within. The heat warmed him, burned away the biting cold that had lodged in his bones. A crash of splintered timber jolted him back to the present. The gate was down. The undead horde began spilling into the courtyard. Wights piled atop one another, rotting limbs and gnashing jaws forming a wave of death. Above them loomed the pale forms of white walkers, stepping with eerie grace. One locked eyes with Jon, its icy gaze narrowing in challenge. A single thought raged in Jon's mind. If this sword is truly Lightbringer, now is the time to test it. He stepped out of the circle of torches, blood still trickling down his forearm, fire streaming from Longclaw. Every pair of living eyes in that courtyard took in the sight of their king, sword aflame like a beacon in the darkness, and a ragged cheer erupted from a dozen throats. Hope flared alongside the flames. Jon rushed to meet the first wave of wights, plunging into the mass of bone and rancid flesh. He swung the sword in a wide arc, and wherever the blade passed, creatures of the dead ignited in bursts of orange flame. Their skulls caved, limbs crumbled, torsos collapsed into ash. The intense heat radiating from the blade seemed to sear the wights at contact, undoing the magic that animated them. Jon felt no recoil from the sword, only a fierce momentum that urged him onward, deeper into the fight. Behind him, Tormund bellowed a war cry and drove his axe into the nearest wight's skull. Davos, though no skilled swordsman, stabbed diligently with a dragonglass dagger at any undead that slipped past Tormund's heavy swings. Brienne rallied a knot of knights to repel another breach in the courtyard's perimeter, while archers from the walls rained shafts down on the new wave of monstrosities flooding through the shattered gate. The melee was fierce, a press of bodies surging back and forth like tidal currents. Jon slashed and cut, carving paths through the wights, each stroke leaving a trail of cinders and flame. Yet the undead were innumerable, scrambling from every direction, drawn by the lure of living flesh. At one point, Jon felt a clawed hand clamp onto his injured shoulder, sending pain lancing down his side. He pivoted and slammed the fiery blade backward, incinerating the wight that clung to him. Another swarm leapt over its falling body. He braced, slashing in a desperate flurry that left a ring of smoldering remains at his feet. Somewhere in the chaos, he glimpsed Arya spinning past 2 staggering corpses, her small crossbow discarded in favor of needle. Her face was smeared with dirt and gore, yet her movements were lightning quick. As soon as she felled one wight, she pivoted to strike another, an unyielding dance that took her through the thickest press. Jon couldn't protect her from afar, not when each second demanded every bit of his focus. He forced himself to trust her skill, driving deeper into the mob where the White Walkers waited. One walker approached, brandishing a blade of frozen crystal that shimmered like starfire. Its gaze flicked to Jon's flaming sword, and Jon heard a low hiss escape the creature. Almost like anger or fear, they clashed. Sparks flew as the magical ice met living flame. The impact jarred Jon's arms, yet he pressed forward, letting the heat and power of Lightbringer guide his strike. The White Walker parried with inhuman strength, forcing him to pivot and slash again. Each collision sent arcs of frost and embers spiraling into the air. The walker struck at Jon's flank, but Jon caught the blow, redirecting it with an upward swipe that briefly locked their blades in a blazing cross. With a furious yell, Jon ripped the sword free, turned, and drove the tip of the flaming steel through the walker's torso. The creature's eyes widened in what might have been shock. A wave of intense heat coursed through the contact point, radiating outward. The walker shattered into a flurry of ice shards, dissolving into nothing at Jon's feet. Jon's chest heaved, sweat matting his hair despite the cold. He allowed himself a split-second glance at the shattered remains. The bright flicker in the sword had not dimmed. The flame still burned, unwavering. Part of him marveled at the wonder of it. A blade that truly could stand against these ancient foes. Then he heard a scream from somewhere to his left, pulling him back to the fray. A voice cut through the din, one he recognized. Sansa Dottajot. She stood on a balcony above the courtyard, flanked by several archers. Horror contorted her features as she witnessed the avalanche of death from her vantage point. She shouted for the defenders to fall back to the inner keep if the courtyard was lost. Indeed, more of the undead spilled through the gates, pushing the living into a smaller and smaller circle. Jon sliced a wight in half, then called to Tormund, who was smashing a rotting skull with his axe. "We can't hold the yard. We need to pull back to the Great Hall, set up a choke point." Tormund grunted, kicking aside a twitching hand. "Hey, we can't stay out here. We'll be surrounded in minutes." He turned and began shouting orders to the men around him, urging them to retreat in groups so no one got left behind. The defenders fought a desperate withdrawal. Brienne and her knights took the lead, locking shields as they moved toward the door that led into the castle's main hall. Davos guided a limping soldier, cursing every time a wight came too close. Arya broke off from the melee, hacking down 2 more undead before joining the group near the doors. Jon lingered near the gate's remains, covering their retreat with sweeps of the flaming blade. He cast frantic glances for any stragglers, grabbing a wounded man by the collar and practically throwing him toward the keep. Under Sansa's direction, a trio of archers on the balcony above loosed arrow after arrow, thinning the horde long enough for the living to scramble inside. Jon was the last to withdraw, lungs burning from exertion. Wights clawed at him from every angle. He cut them down, leaving charred corpses in his wake. Just as he reached the threshold of the door, an inhuman roar rose from behind him. He risked a glance backward and froze. The shadow of something massive fell across the courtyard, a monstrous winged shape wreathed in icy mist. Its body was a patchwork of frozen flesh and exposed bone. Once a dragon, now a perversion of life. The undead dragon craned its neck, jaw opening in a silent shriek. Its dead eyes glowed blue, same as its master. And upon its back, upright and regal in his contempt, sat the Night King. For a single heartbeat, Jon's blood ran colder than any northern wind. Then, his survival instincts roared. He dove inside, crashing to the flagstones just as the creature exhaled a torrent of freezing blue fire that blasted the courtyard. An explosion of ice and rubble hurled shards of stone everywhere, pelting the wooden beams. The air turned frigid enough to sting exposed skin, raw. Through the swirling debris, Jon glimpsed the dragon's hulking mass perched on the ruined gate. The Night King peered into the keep with expressionless eyes, the faintest tilt of his head suggesting awareness of Joan's presence. Those few defenders still outside were instantly consumed by the undead dragon's barrage, an eruption of razor-sharp frost that froze living flesh on contact. Their screams cut short as bodies toppled in rigid lumps. From within the keep, men and women recoiled in terror, stumbling back from the doorways. Thick clouds of sparkling ice swirled in aftershocks, coating the walls, the floors, and any unfortunate soul caught in the path. John braced himself against the nearest pillar, panting as the battered doors were slammed shut behind him. Several knights heaved heavy beams into place, forming a makeshift barricade. Their faces were pale, and not just from cold. Fear and heartbreak lingered in every eye. Screams of those still out in the courtyard had already faded. It was quieter here in the Great Hall, but only marginally. The high ceiling and walls were lit by a scattering of torches and braziers, throwing dancing shadows over the battered tables stacked against the walls. The moans of the wounded echoed from a corner where healers hurried to apply bandages and staunch bleeding. Clusters of northern soldiers, wildlings and knights, tried to reorder themselves into some semblance of a defense. Every face wore the weight of exhaustion. Sansa rushed toward John, stepping carefully around fallen debris. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes wild with urgency. "John, how do we fight that?" she demanded in a hushed breath, glancing at the shattered door. "An undead dragon, if it can freeze the walls." John cut her off. "We have to hold the interior. The gates are gone. Our only chance is to fortify these halls, funnel the dead into choke points." He wanted to sound confident, but even his own voice wavered. "If the Night King breaks through, we must be ready." A distant roar shook the castle walls, followed by another blast of that glacial flame. Ice crept through cracks in the stone, sending plumes of powder into the corridors. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. "We've evacuated most of the non-combatants to the crypts. But if the dragon's breath can breach the foundation?" John didn't let her finish. The possibility that even the crypts might not be safe was a terror none of them could bear to dwell on. "Has Bran come inside?" John asked. She nodded, her gaze flicking toward one of the side passages. Arya brought him in, along with a group of guards. "He's in the library tower with a small escort. They hope to keep him out of the main fray." John said nothing for a moment, the significance of the three-eyed raven's powers heavy on his mind. Then he exhaled and turned to the defenders. "Archers, form ranks along the corridors. Spears in front. Barricade every side passage. We'll funnel them here if the walls are breached again." The men saluted, though the weariness in their eyes hinted at how near they were to collapsing. Tormund stumbled in, blood caked on his beard, dragging a wounded knight whose name John didn't know. Brienne and Davos helped carry others who could barely walk, laying them gently on the floor near the makeshift infirmary. The wounded knight tried to speak, but managed only a ragged cough. Maester Walken hurried over, kneeling with bandages, though from the pallor of the knight's face it was clear hope was slim. John forced himself to look away. Pain gnawed at his conscience. Each death hammered home his failures. But the fight was not yet done. A series of dull thuds and crunches echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable scrape of talons on stone. The undead dragon had crawled along the battlements, searching for another point to unleash its destructive breath. The defenders tensed, weapons rattling in trembling hands, expecting the next barrage to erupt through the high windows, or even blow a hole in the roof. Melisandre appeared at Joan's side, pressing one hand to her chest. She looked drained, lips parted as though breathing took immense effort. Still, her eyes shone with a fervent light. "The flames grant you strength, but you must take the fight to him," she gasped. "Let the defenders handle the whites. You must face the Night King yourself." John stared at her. "That's madness. I can't just leave." "You can. You must. That blade is our only true chance of stopping him." She gestured to Longclaw, still flickering with fire, though less brightly than before. "If you do not kill him, they will never stop. You have to end this." He gazed around the hall, seeing the exhaustion etched on every face. She was right. The hordes would keep coming until their master was defeated or the living were utterly annihilated. The White Walkers had proven time and again that severing the head could destroy the body. If the Night King died, perhaps his army would fall with him. Joan's heart hammered. The notion of facing that ancient being, on the back of an undead dragon, no less, seemed the stuff of grim legend. Yet here he was. He took a step forward, gripping the hilt of the fiery sword. The warmth pulsed, as if responding to his resolve. "How do I reach him?" he murmured. At that question, a voice rang out behind them. "We can go to the ramparts. If we can get up there, we might draw him down." Arya approached, wiping blood from a small wound on her brow. Her expression was grim, but unwavering. "I'll go with you." Jon opened his mouth to protest. The idea of Arya risking an encounter with the Night King filled him with dread. He glanced at Sansa, who wore a horrified look. Yet Arya's stance was unyielding, her eyes afire with the same determination he had seen the day she bested Brienne in the courtyard. She had come too far, survived too much to be hidden away now. "Fine," he conceded, voice hoarse. "But we'll need a plan. Tormund Davos, Brienne. Hold the Great Hall. Don't let the Whites through to the inner keep. I'll head to the ramparts with Arya. If the Night King gives chase, we'll try to separate him from that dragon." Davos wiped soot from his cheeks, nodding reluctantly. "We'll do what we can. But get it done quick, Jon. We can't hold these halls forever." "Nander." Tormund clapped Jon's good shoulder with a rough, calloused hand. "Go on, Crow. Kill that bastard." Brienne inclined her head, though her concern for both Jon and Arya was clear. "Fight well." Jon exchanged a brief glance with Sansa, whose lips trembled with words unspoken. The fear in her eyes mingled with an unshakable faith that he could somehow end this. He gave her hand a quick squeeze, then turned on his heel, striding toward the nearest staircase that led up into the castle's higher levels. Arya followed close at his side, light on her feet despite the weight of the moment. They climbed stairwell after stairwell, passing through corridors where frightened servants cowered, pressing themselves against the walls. The echoes of the battle below reverberated through the stones. Screams, clangs of weapons, the roar of distant flames. The winter air grew colder as they ascended, the wind howling through arrow slits and broken shutters. At last, they reached an exterior walkway leading to the ramparts. Before stepping into the open, Jon slid a narrow arrow loop open and peered through. A bleak vista met his gaze. The courtyard below was in chaos. Undead had breached in multiple spots. Overwhelming patches of defenders. The main gate lay in ruins, the unstoppable tide surging into the outer wards. Closer to the walls, fires burned where catapults had spilled their blazing tar, blackening the snow with ash. As he tilted his gaze upward, he saw the monstrous silhouette of the undead dragon perched atop a collapsed portion of wall, methodically spewing gouts of freezing flame. Soldiers scattered like ants beneath it. With each breath of that unholy fire, frost spread across the stones, making them brittle. The beast was slowly tearing the fortress apart. And there, astride its back, was the Night King. The pale crown of ice upon his head glinted in the starlight, his body erect in a posture of eerie calm. The swirl of wind and snow parted around him, as if even nature itself took heed of his presence. Jon felt a chill that no flame could dispel. He turned to Arya. "If we can lure him away from the dragon, we might have a chance. Otherwise, that thing will freeze us before we ever get close." "Namen." Arya nodded, biting her lip. "We'll have to be quick." Jon pushed open the heavy wooden door leading onto the battlements. The wind raged the moment they stepped out, blasting them with flakes of ice and snow. The ramparts here overlooked a portion of the courtyard, where the undead had gathered in a writhing mass. Corpses of the fallen littered the walkway, guards who had tried to hold this stretch of wall against impossible odds. Jon's stomach churned at the sight of them, yet he forced himself to move on, kneeling by one of the parapets to gain a vantage point. Arya crouched beside him, scanning the rooftop with hawk-like focus. A bone-chilling screech tore across the sky. The undead dragon shifted on its perch, powerful talons grinding stone into dust. The Night King's gaze swept the castle battlements, as though seeking the exact place to strike next. Jon could almost feel the weight of that gaze lingering at the edge of his vision. Heart pounding, he motioned for Arya to follow him toward a narrower walkway that circled the top of the keep. They picked their way carefully over rubble and fallen stones until they neared a tower that jutted above the rest. Its top partially collapsed. Jagged blocks and collapsed roof beams had formed a precarious slope, and beyond it lay a platform of sorts. A vantage high enough to see over most of Winterfell. If the Night King spotted them here, perhaps he would come. Perhaps he would sense the flaming sword, the threat to his dominion. It was a dangerous gamble, but the only plan Jon could devise. Arya hurried ahead, nimble as a cat. She scaled the treacherous debris until she reached the top, offering Jon a hand. He took it, grunting as the pain in his shoulder flared. Once they stood together on the half-crumbled tower, the wind whipped at them with savage force, making it difficult to remain upright. From this high vantage, the devastation of the siege was undeniable. Winterfell's walls glowed with scattered fires, the courtyard a churning sea of undead forms. Screams filtered up from below, mingling with the hiss of the undead dragon's breath. Jon ignited a flare of anger at the sight, a fury at what had been done to this ancient place that had sheltered him, made him who he was. He raised Lightbringer high, letting its flames catch the Night King's attention, if he was watching. The sword's glow stood out like a beacon against the storm. Arya unslung her dragon glass-tipped spear and stood ready, scanning the skies for any sign of movement. At first, nothing happened. The Night King and his dragon remained at the far end of the castle, continuing their relentless assault. Jon's heart sank. If the creature didn't notice them, they had no hope of stopping the threat from here. He took a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves, and shouted into the swirling wind. "Come for me!" he roared, voice echoing across the courtyard, though how far it carried was anyone's guess. "Face me." Arya glanced at him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but she said nothing. Her breath fogged in the biting air. Then, as if in answer, the undead dragon let out a roar that shook the stones beneath their feet. Its massive shape unfurled from its perch, wings spreading in a horrifying display of ragged membranes and blackened sinew. The gust of air that followed nearly knocked Jon off balance. The creature ascended, climbing into the sky, swirling snow scattering around it like shards of broken glass in moonlight. The Night King guided the dragon with subtle movements, turning it in a slow arc. Jon sensed those frozen eyes falling upon him. The flame in long claw a bright slash of color against the darkness. The creature circled overhead, passing so close that Jon felt the downdraft from its wings buffet him. Arya crouched, her grip white-knuckled on her spear. Jon braced himself, expecting a torrent of ice fire to rain upon them. Instead, the dragon veered, flapping ponderous wings that kicked up swirling drifts. Its skeletal tail slammed into a nearby tower, demolishing it in a thunderous shower of masonry. Jon realized the Night King was clearing a space, smashing away any obstacles that might block the confrontation. The creature let out another unearthly shriek, then swooped low. Jon dived to the side, flattening himself against the broken parapet. Arya rolled in the opposite direction, narrowly avoiding the sweep of a massive claw. Fragments of rubble clattered down the steep slope. Wind howled, carrying fragments of ice that stung exposed skin. The dragon rose again, banking near the edge of the tower. The Night King dismounted in a single fluid motion, landing atop the battered rampart. He stood a stone's throw from Jon and Arya, regarding them with the same impassive blue stare. Snow whipped around him, but he seemed impervious to the bitter cold. The long, jagged spear of ice in his hand glimmered in the half-light. Behind him, the undead dragon perched, tail thrashing, as if waiting for a signal to unleash devastation. Arya tensed. Jon steadied his breathing, lifting the blazing sword. The moment felt suspended, as if time itself hesitated. The Night King regarded the flaming blade without so much as a flicker in his inhuman eyes. Then he advanced a step. The ice spear angled forward. Jon's mind roiled with the memory of Hardhome, the savage battles, the countless dead. He remembered the terror he felt as he watched the Night King raise an army of corpses with a single gesture. Yet now the prophecy and the fiery sword converged on this moment. If Lightbringer was indeed the weapon of legend, then this confrontation was its purpose. The Night King lunged with supernatural speed, forcing Jon to meet the blow head-on. The flame-wreathed steel clashed with ice, sending sparks and frost into the air. The impact nearly drove Jon to his knees. The creature was impossibly strong, an ancient malevolence honed to lethal precision. Jon twisted away, bringing the sword around in a scorching arc. The Night King parried with his spear, the tip shrieking against the steel before sliding away, leaving a trail of frost that crackled along the blade's surface. Arya darted around, searching for an opening. She flicked her gaze to the undead dragon perched behind its master. The creature's milky eyes focused on Jon, though its ear-splitting screech suggested it sensed Arya's presence. She tightened her grip, mentally calculating the distance. If she could strike the Night King from behind while Jon distracted him, it might give them a chance. Jon and the Night King circled each other. The wind shrieked, rattling loose stones, making every footstep perilous. Jon's heart hammered with a mixture of awe and terror. Each time the creature's spear flashed, the air seemed to freeze around it, clinging like hoarfrost to Jon's cloak. But the flames on Jon's sword glowed brighter, as though fed by the intensity of the conflict. They clashed again, a furious series of blows that reverberated across the tower. Jon poured all his strength into each strike, the raw heat of the sword making the very air shimmer. The Night King fought with eerie calm, every motion precise. Jon felt his muscles scream in protest. Even with Lightbringer's power, the cold pressed in, sapping his stamina. Suddenly, Arya darted in, thrusting her spear at the Night King's flank. The tip grazed the creature's armor, dragging a screech of metal. The Night King whirled, inhuman reflexes allowing him to dodge the brunt of her attack. With a lightning-fast motion, he raised his free hand. A shock wave of freezing energy pulsed outward, flinging Arya back. She slammed into a jagged portion of collapsed stone, wincing in pain. Jon seized the moment. As the Night King turned, Jon slashed at his back. But somehow, the creature twisted mid-motion, bringing the ice spear up to block. Sparks and shards flew. Jon staggered, nearly losing his grip. The swirling snow made it hard to see, and he dimly heard Arya grunt behind him, forcing herself to stand despite the blow she had taken. Below them, the courtyard roiled with continuing battle. Echoes of screams, the clash of steel, and the roar of the undead dragon reverberated in the storm. The beast snapped its jaws, anticipating a moment to strike. Each time Arya or Jon came too close, it reared, unleashing a threat of that freezing breath. They had no clear path to attack the monster itself. Not with the Night King so near. Jon knew time was against them. The defenders below could not hold indefinitely. Even with the flaming sword in his hand, the Night King showed no signs of faltering. Striking him down would require an opening, a perfect moment. Jon's mind raced, recalling how a Valyrian steel dagger had been the end of one walker. But the Night King was mightier than all his lieutenants combined. Could the flaming steel be enough? Arya steadied herself, ignoring the blood that trickled from a cut along her hairline. She locked eyes with Jon for a second, silently confirming a plan. Then she feinted to the left, sprinting in a half-circle around the Night King. Jon lunged from the right, forcing the creature to split its attention. The flurry of blows resumed, Jon's fiery arcs clashing with the spear, Arya darting in and out with agile strikes whenever she spotted a gap. The wind whipped around them, as if drawn by the vortex of their struggle. But the Night King moved with preternatural grace, blocking or dodging each attempt to slip a blade beneath his guard. Arya's spear jabbed at his side, only to meet the blunt end of his weapon. The Night King spun, hurling her back once more with a savage strike of supernatural force. She hit the stones, coughed, and tried to rise again. Jon attacked in a fury, slamming Lightbringer against the spear in a mighty overhand blow. The steel flared, and for an instant, the Night King gave ground, sliding back a step. Jon pressed forward, adrenaline surging. He swung again, a horizontal slash aimed at the creature's midsection, hoping to break the spear or slip past it. But the Night King trapped the blade mid-swing, hooking the spear beneath the flaming sword. A twist of the wrist, An impossible surge of strength, and John felt Longclaw jerk out of his hands. He scrambled to hold on, but the sword clattered across the rubble, flames sputtering though not extinguished. Panic choked him. Unarmed, he stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing on a loose stone. The Night King advanced, eyes glowing with frigid menace. Ice spread across the spear's surface, forming jagged edges that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. John's chest tightened. If the Night King thrust now, John had no way to parry. He glimpsed the flaming sword lying several feet away, too far to reach in time. Despair prickled at his thoughts. Below, the shrieks of the undead filled the night, underscored by the rumble of partial collapses within the castle walls. A sudden, high-pitched shout tore through the wind. Arya vaulted from behind a broken pillar, leaping onto the Night King's back in a desperate gamble. She hooked an arm around his neck, attempting to drive her dragon-glass dagger into his icy temple. The Night King whirled, slamming her into a stone outcrop. The dagger clattered from her fingers, and she cried out as she lost her grip, dropping to the stones in a heap. John found a surge of fury. He lunged for the sword, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder. The Night King, sensing the movement, twisted away from Arya's prone form and hurled the spear. The crystalline weapon hissed as it flew through the swirling snow, a deadly missile of ice aimed at Joan's chest. He dove forward, hitting the rubble hard, one arm extended toward Lightbringer. The spear scraped past his ribs, close enough to tear a rent in his cloak, its frost radiating a painful cold. It buried itself in a cracked stone behind him, sending shards spraying. Joan's fingers brushed the hilt of the flaming sword, and he grasped it, turning just in time to see the Night King closing in. John forced himself to his knees, bringing the blade up in a trembling guard. The Night King grabbed the spear, still embedded in the stone, and tore it free, stepping closer. Ice crystals hung in the air around him like a macabre halo. John braced for the final clash, ready to strike with whatever remained in his battered body. Arya coughed behind them, trying to rise. Then the undead dragon roared from its perch, a shriek that tore the wind apart. Its ribs heaved, chest expanding with unnatural force, preparing to unleash another torrent of freezing flame. John could see the swirl of blue energies gathering in its maw, an infernal glow that would reduce them all to icy corpses if unleashed at close range. He had one option. With a guttural yell, John hurled himself forward, swinging Lightbringer at the Night King's midsection. Their blades met in a deafening collision. Sparks and ice shards rained. The shockwave from the strike rippled outward, sending cracks through the broken masonry. The Night King held his ground, forcing John's blazing steel to a standstill. But the strain was evident in his posture. This was no effortless block. Whether it was the sword's power or John's sheer desperation, the Night King trembled, locked in a mortal duel. A searing wind battered them from behind, the undead dragon's breath igniting, about to engulf them. A single heartbeat passed, though it felt like eternity. Arya staggered up in that moment, her eyes wide with horror at the lethal column of frost about to enshroud them all. John saw her face, saw the choice she was about to make. In a desperate burst of speed, Arya dove toward the Night King's legs, hooking an arm around his knee. He tottered, momentarily unbalanced. John channeled every ounce of will into the sword, driving the flame closer to the Night King's heart. The creature tried to twist free, but Arya clung to his leg with fierce determination. Time seemed to freeze, as if even the dragon's breath had paused. John roared, slamming the blade forward. The tip of the flaming sword struck the Night King's chest, just above the breastplate. For an instant, the night was lit as if by the sun. The fire on the blade flared with such intensity that Joan's vision widened out. A sound like shattering ice roared through his ears. The force threw him backward, tumbling across the broken stones. A wave of blistering heat rolled over him, tangling with the freezing gust from the dragon's breath. He lost sense of up and down as he spiraled into darkness, battered by wind and debris. Pain shot through his ribs, and he could barely breathe, certain that at least one bone was cracked. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the upheaval subsided, and he found himself sprawled amid a pile of shattered rock. His ears rang, His eyes stung. Slowly, he blinked away the glare of the blast. The wind still howled, but the vantage above Winterfell was changed. Snow no longer fell in swirling eddies. Instead, it drifted lazily as though uncertain how to proceed. Jon pushed himself upright, coughing violently. Every breath hurt. Torment. He still clutched Lightbringer, though now only faint embers flickered along its length. The main conflagration was gone, replaced by a sullen glow. He blinked until his vision cleared and looked around. The undead dragon crouched on a nearby tower, tail thrashing. But something was different. Its glowing blue eyes had dimmed, flickering in and out as though the magic animating it was faltering. He turned his gaze to where the Night King had stood. In the swirl of half-melted snow and rubble, the ancient tyrant lay on his back, the ice spear broken beside him. A fracture ran through the icy crown of his head, spiderwebbing across the features of his face. The body twitched once, twice, as if trying to rise. Then, with a low keening sound, the Night King's form cracked further. Chunks of frost and crystal sloughed away like disintegrating porcelain. A final piercing wail. Then he shattered into 1,000 fragments that dissolved into slush on the stones. Jon stared in disbelief, chest heaving. The Night King was dead. Arya coughed from somewhere off to the side. He scrambled toward her, ignoring the throbbing protest of his injured shoulder. She leaned against a collapsed piece of masonry, forehead bleeding, but alive. He gripped her arm, relief flooding through him so sharply he almost wept. She managed a small wry grin, though her voice was raspy. Did we do it?" Jon helped her stand, supporting her weight as she wobbled. Together, they looked out over the castle. The undead dragon reared its head once more, mouth opening as if to roar, but no sound emerged. Its eyes dulled fully, the glow fading into empty black pits. Its massive frame swayed, losing balance. In a tremendous crash, it slid off the tower, smashing into the courtyard below. Even from that distance, Jon heard the tumult of stone and wood splintering beneath its colossal bulk. A hush gripped the air. Across the battlements, the wights that had been assaulting Winterfell's defenders crumbled where they stood, turning into heaps of dead flesh or collapsing bones. Low moans gave way to the cracking of brittle joints as the magic animating them dissipated all at once. The castle survivors watched in stunned silence as hundreds upon hundreds of undead simply dropped. Archers on the walls lowered their bows. Spears clattered to the ground. For a moment, the hush was absolute. Then a slow rising cheer began to build. From the ramparts, from the courtyard, from the battered keep. It climbed into the frigid air, a cry of astonished triumph. The defenders of Winterfell, bloodied and exhausted, realized in that instant that the impossible had happened. The Night King was no more. His army fell with him. They were saved. Arya let out a trembling laugh, though tears lined her cheeks. Jon nodded numbly, hardly able to believe it. The sword in his hand still bore a dim flicker, a remnant of the mighty flame that had coursed through it. In the space of a heartbeat, everything had changed. They had done the unthinkable. Jon helped Arya brace against his side, and together they picked their way back down the rubble. The castle below was in ruins. Smoke rose from collapsed sections of the wall, entire towers battered by the dragon's assault. Bodies littered the courtyard. But the living, those who still stood, found themselves gathering, hugging one another, weeping in relief. They were halfway down broken tower steps when they encountered a group of survivors. Brienne, splattered with blood but upright, supporting Podrick, whose arm dangled at an odd angle. Davos hurried over, eyes wide as he looked Jon and Arya up and down. Tormund, leaning heavily on an axe, offered a bleary grin. "You did it." The wildling breathed, voice thick with shock. "I saw that bright light up there, then everything started crumbling." Jon managed a weak nod. "He's gone. The Night King is gone." A wave of stunned relief broke over the group. Brienne closed her eyes, murmuring thanks to any god listening. Davos exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to his chest. Tormund let out a ragged laugh, tears brimming in his eyes as he glanced at the carnage around them. For every living soul who still stood, many more lay still on the ground. But it was over. Somehow, impossibly, it was over. An echo of that cheer they had heard from the ramparts spread to the courtyard. A chorus of voices that grew in fervor. Soldiers banged swords against shields in a ragged beat, some collapsing to their knees in exhaustion or in silent mourning for fallen friends. The combination of heartbreak and gratitude hung thick in the air, a swirling mix of tears and rejoicing. Sansa emerged from the great hall, accompanied by Gendry and a handful of knights. Her eyes were rimmed with weariness, hair matted with sweat, but an undeniable light of hope shone through her exhaustion. She spotted Jon and rushed forward, ignoring the debris that threatened to trip her. Jon half expected her to break into tears, but she merely clasped his hand, looking from him to Arya, who still leaned on his shoulder. "You're both alive," she whispered, voice quavering with unspoken relief. Jon squeezed her hand in return, wanting to speak 1,000 words but finding none. The swirl of half-frozen blood and ash on the ground, the smoke trailing upward, the hush settling over the remains of the battlefield. All of it was a testament to the price they had paid for victory. And yet, the sky felt different now, as if the cold had softened. Dawn was breaking behind a bank of cloud, casting a subtle glow on the horizon. A gentle nudge at Jon's side made him turn. Ghost stepped forward, muzzle brushing his hand. The direwolf was spotted with black gore and a few cuts, but alive. Jon let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, resting a hand in Ghost's fur. The wolf's red eyes glinted with a quiet acknowledgement, as though understanding the magnitude of what had transpired. Melisandre appeared last of all, emerging from the smoky darkness near the gates, where heaps of the dead lay unmoving at last. Her red robe was torn, her face drawn and pale. She looked at Jon, at Arya, at the flicker of flame still dancing on the tip of the sword, then allowed herself a small, weary nod. "Azor Ahai," she murmured, something like awe in her voice. "You have delivered the dawn." Jon couldn't find the strength to argue. He lowered the sword, finally letting the sputtering flames recede. Embers trailed away, carried on the wind. The battered remains of Winterfell bore witness to what had taken place here. The defeat of an ancient evil, and the dawn of a fragile hope. For the moment, no one spoke of prophecies or destinies. The only words exchanged were ones of comfort, of relief and of raw grief for the dead. As the sky brightened, the living gathered what strength remained to tend to the wounded, to wrap the fallen in cloth, to quench the smoldering fires threatening to consume half the fortress. Through it all, Jon stayed on his feet, half numb, forging a path among the ruins to help wherever he could, lifting broken beams from trapped survivors, carrying water to the injured, pausing often to check that Arya and Sansa still stood. The taste of ash and blood lingered in his mouth. His muscles trembled from exhaustion. Eventually, the shock began to settle, replaced by the dawning realization that they had survived. Over the next hours, the moans of pain slowly subsided, replaced by the scraping of shovels clearing rubble and the soft murmurs of reunited friends. Cries of mourning rose for each new body uncovered. Cooks emerged from the half-collapsed kitchens to distribute bread and what little hot broth they could manage over hastily stoked fires. Sam, pale and shaking, did his best to help the maester with the wounded. In the midst of it all, Jon found himself standing by the ruined gate, staring out at the open field beyond. The morning light revealed a wasteland of broken weapons, half-submerged corpses, and swirling banks of snow. An unreal quiet settled there, where only hours ago the dead had advanced in unstoppable waves. Now, they lay scattered and inert, the shadows of a nightmare banished by a single stroke of flame-ignited steel. He squeezed his eyes shut, remembering the final moment of the battle, the Night King's silent expression, the sensation of power coursing through Longclaw. It had nearly broken him, yet here he stood, alive and free. An old memory stirred, of Jorah Mormont presenting him the sword, telling him it was his now, that he must do it honor. Jon exhaled, shoulders slumping, the tension slowly draining away. Behind him, the faint crunch of snow signaled footsteps. He turned to see Sansa approaching, cloak trailing behind her. Her face was pale, eyes tired. But she summoned a small, genuine smile. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Jon tried to answer, but words failed. At length he managed to nod, though tears pricked at the edges of his vision. Sansa reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, standing beside him as they gazed at the scorched, ruined field. Neither said much. They didn't have to. It was enough to be alive, to know the dawn had come. A short distance away, Arya sat on a broken piece of timber, wrapping a bandage around her ribs under Gendry's concerned watch. Tormund and Davos shuffled past, deeply engrossed in directing men to clear bodies from the main courtyard. Brienne and Podrick organized others to search for survivors in the outer wards. Melisandre knelt by the extinguished ring of torches that had formed the ritual circle, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Everywhere, life stirred anew, though it hard to tell how many had been lost. Jon laid a hand atop Sansa's, comforted by her presence. "We'll rebuild," he said softly, thinking of the castle, the houses, the realm itself. "We have to." She nodded. "We will," she replied, her voice laced with the quiet strength he had come to depend on. "Winterfell endures. The North endures." He swallowed, thinking of all who had paid the price for that endurance. But the dawn sky overhead was a pale, hopeful gold, no longer the grim iron gray of unrelenting winter. Spring might still be distant, but it was no longer unimaginable. Ghost padded up, pressing his muzzle into Jon's free hand. He ruffled the direwolf's fur, his throat tight with gratitude. Then he turned to follow Sansa back into what remained of Winterfell. Each step reminded him of the injuries he'd sustained. Each breath ached in his ribs, but a strange warmth spread through his core, a lingering echo of the magic that had infused Lightbringer. He glanced at the sword, sheathed now at his hip. The flame was gone, leaving only the Valyrian steel. Yet he felt a bond with it, that transcended steel and leather, as though the sword still carried the memory of that incandescent blaze. Perhaps the prophecy was true. Perhaps he was Azor Ahai reborn. But standing there, surveying the hollow-eyed survivors, the battered walls, and the countless dead, he found he did not care about titles or legends. All that mattered was that he had done what he must. The Night King was vanquished. The living had prevailed, though at terrible cost. Jon exhaled, stepping carefully around the scattered debris. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, new challenges in a realm that still tottered on the brink of chaos. Yet they had passed the greatest threat of all, and hope glimmered in the ashes. In the hush that followed the night's terror, Winterfell breathed again, wounded but unbroken. And Jon Snow, weighed by prophecy and shaped by duty, walked among the living as the first true rays of morning brushed the blackened stones. The day was theirs. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Winter had tested them, but dawn had come. And in that dawn, the faintest warmth of spring.